programmatic to expand urban tree canopy in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Essentially, today we're gathered to channel your recommendations to guide those working in the policy and funding arenas on how to best support your work. We'll be laying the groundwork to support Bay states and the District of Columbia in developing tree canopy action plans and distilling watershed-wide tree canopy priorities, with which the project team will deliver up to leadership at the Chesapeake Bay program. The ultimate goal of all of these efforts is to accelerate equitable, climate-resilient tree canopy implementation across the watershed. Over the next 2 days, you'll hear from some amazing people about data and tools and approaches to advance tree funding and policy outcomes. And our hope is for you to come away with specific actionable ideas to implement in your state or jurisdiction. All right, so that's a bit of background on the event. And our agenda is actually structured over the course of these 2 days, right? And it's organized around the core themes of climate resilience, tree loss, and equity. We'll also be putting a strong focus on formulating local strategies for action. We'll be hearing keynotes and panel discussions, and importantly, we'll set aside some time for you all to chat with each other. I'm definitely looking forward to the engaged discussion portion of the event. As indicated on the slides, today's presentations and discussions focus on the first two themes, climate and tree loss. And our agenda is full. We have a 1-hour lunch break on the docket, but otherwise we'll be powering through this agenda. So if you feel the need to attend to your bodily functions, take a stretch or bathroom break, definitely do so. All right. So now that we're all settled in, a bit of housekeeping. All the participant lines are muted and will be unmuted during the discussion groups. Even with the lines muted, though, we still want to hear from you throughout the event. So be sure to share your comments and questions in the chat box. We want to make sure that we're capturing all of the interest and whatever other thoughts might be coming up for you around solutions. And so definitely be sure to use the chat box. We do also have a few ground rules to help us make the most of our time together. Please stay present, take breaks as needed, as I mentioned earlier, and in the breakout rooms, be engaged and respectful. Stay cognizant of speaking up and stepping back to give others a chance to contribute. And for everybody using the chat, which should be everybody, okay, should be everybody, treat the event like an in-person one. There's at in-person events, there's like side conversations in the hallways and stuff. Feel free to connect with others on the line via the private messaging function in your chat box. Just know that these messages won't be saved and recorded like the ones in the main chat. The project team will send out highlights from the main chat after the roundtable concludes. And speaking of recording, this event is being recorded, which you probably got a notification about on the line when you joined. The main room is being recorded so that we can share the presentations out with those who missed the live event. And the breakout rooms are being recorded, but not shared out in order for the project team to recap the discussions. Okay, so that we're through our housekeeping. Whew, we're through the housekeeping. So as an introduction, just to kind of break the ice, because we have such a large group, we won't do any virtual or verbal introductions, but definitely change your Zoom name to reflect your name, which entity you're affiliated with. So if that's like an organization or local group. And then be sure to also put your state initials in your name as well. On the screen, we've got we've got in our slide deck a map of actually where everybody is joining from today. You can see there are folks joining from all across the watershed, and we are really excited that there's such a great representation from folks all across the watershed. And so Our big icebreaker to just get ourselves started and warmed up is answering this question in the chat box. Is, if you can, share one thing you're hoping to get out of the roundtable. And so right now we are going to be scanning the chat box. It's so good to like reconnect with old friends and see lots of familiar names on the line today. I'm excited to engage with you all. All right, we're wanting to look at better protect trees through policy. Okay, we're looking at how to optimize funding streams. Super important. The trees are not going to maintain themselves, so we have to do that for them, of course. Yeah, definitely. You know, that the ability to cross promote and learn from folks across the watershed is really important. Supporting other local communities, getting the public interested in, you know, ways that they can get engaged and in planting and maintenance efforts on their lands. Yeah, definitely a lot of folks here interested in garnering more public interest. Preserving mature forests, so critical, so critical. Awesome, awesome. Covering maintenance costs. Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Yep, definitely interested in capacity building as well. Fantastic. Yeah, innovations on private property. I mean, you all have probably heard the stat, right? That 80% of trees in cities across the country are on private property. So yeah, private property interventions are absolutely essential if we are to make meaningful progress on preserving and restoring healthy urban canopies. All right. Regional local collaboration. We love a partnership. Okay, partnership. You better be in that chat. Okay, I'm going to be reporting back. I'm going to be asking you all. Okay, later on. Have you been in the chat? We need to make sure that this is fertile ground for partnerships. Yes, mitigating urban heat impacts, preventing tree loss across the watershed. Yeah, translating data into kind of like more common language. I'm interested in that as well, because, you know, when we're all disseminating studies and being the fun tree nerds that we all are, it's great. But when we're trying to actually translate that to like people who do not spend nearly as much time in these realms, in these spaces with us, it can be a challenge sometimes. So yeah, breaking that communication down, sustaining programs, lots of really great excitement here and engagement. Keep the comments coming. Just know that when you say, you know, what you're looking to do, that helps other folks understand that they're also not alone, and that they may be more inclined to want to connect with you, whether in the private chat function or offline after the event concludes. And so absolutely. And, you know, whether you work at the city level or the state level, you work for the whole region, whether you're working in the private sector, public sector, you're working as a grassroots community organizer or partner, we need you to, and your recommendations so that we can elevate your priorities to help mobilize, you know, funding and policy supports that will ultimately, hopefully, make your jobs and your work a lot easier. And so thank you all for that exciting engagement. For those who have hopped on a little bit later, I introduced myself earlier. I'm Sarah Lily Sewell. I'll be your MC for today. And I'm going to be handing it over to my colleague, Julie Mawhorter at the USDA Forest Service, who will share a little bit more context for how this event came to be, and we'll introduce our first keynote. Julie?
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you all for being here today. It's really exciting to see all the participation in the chat and know that everybody's tuning in from around our big, beautiful watershed. So thank you for being here. Next slide, please. I'm just going to share for a few minutes some kind of big picture pieces about our Chesapeake wide efforts, and then get us right into our keynote speaker. So, this is our big why. All the amazing services that trees in our communities provide, from everything from helping us with our air pollution challenges, our growing challenges with urban heat and extreme heat, stormwater, flooding, which is only increasing with climate change, and also all the benefits of trees for human health, mental health, physical health that have been well documented in the research literature by now. Even everything coming from economic vitality of communities and public safety. So trees provide all of these services as kind of one of our critical infrastructures that we rely on, often taken for granted. But we're here to see how we can promote our policy and funding solutions to better advance these assets in our communities. Next slide. Because of all of these benefits of tree canopy, we included a tree canopy goal in the Chesapeake Watershed Agreement that was established in 2014. All the governors signed on, EPA, and this goal is to expand urban tree canopy by 2,400 acres by 2025, which we're getting awfully close to, a couple years away now. When we talk about urban tree canopy in this goal, we're talking really about communities of all sizes, from the extreme urban case to more rural communities. But the trees in our neighborhoods, in our schools, along our streets, in our parks, these are the trees that make such a difference to us, whether we're in an ultra urban setting or in a more suburban or rural setting. So we have two ways that we track progress towards this goal. One is through counting the number of trees planted that are reported by each state every year to help meet the goals of the Chesapeake Water Pollution Control Diet, the total maximum daily load. And then we also track change through our high resolution land cover, which I'll talk about more in a moment. So next slide. This goal to increase canopy is a net gain goal. So we want to take into account our existing canopy, as well as how it's being maintained, what we're losing each year to all the different forces, from development to natural mortality of trees, storms, pests. We know there's a lot of things chipping away at our canopy. And so we want to maintain as much of it as possible, while also planting more to expand for the next generation and to make up for the losses that we know are occurring. And so we have a tremendous data resource in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, which is that the partnership has invested in high resolution land cover and land use data for the entire watershed, where we had a decade ago individual communities doing these urban tree canopy assessments just for their place. Now we have those data for the whole watershed freely available for communities to use. And not only do we have 1 year of that data, our first year was from 2013, 2014 imagery. Now in the last year, we've had our second year of data from 2017, 2018 time period. And in a couple years, we will have another set of data. So this allows us to start tracking what the trend is over time. Sometimes it can be hard to correctly analyze change from these type of high resolution data sets, but we have a solid methodology with the team of experts that are producing these data to be able to look at what the gains and the losses are at a very fine scale. And so how are we doing in meeting this goal? Well, I know many partners have been working hard on planting trees, and we've seen over 8,300 acres of trees planted since the watershed agreement was started in 2014 up to 2021. So that's been a great effort by many of you in all the states. But we are not keeping pace with the amount of loss that we're seeing. So the numbers at the right are our most recent change analysis that was done. This is just looking at census places in the watershed. That's kind of our urban community footprint to measure change. And we've seen a loss of over 25,000 acres, a net loss in just a 4 to 5 year time window. So that's one of the reasons why we're here today, is to say, how do we get a handle on it? What are the new policy solutions to address this scale of loss? Next slide. I'm excited to share that we have the results of these data and these analyses now available in county level fact sheets. They're hot off the press, just posted on Friday for you all to explore in the breaks and look up what's happening in your county and nearby counties. And we'll share the links to those later in the day. Next slide. The other thing we know is that tree canopy is not equitably distributed in our communities. It's a national trend. We've seen research that shows that really it's our communities of color and low-income communities that are bearing the brunt of climate change, that have the least amount of tree cover and shade, the highest amount of impervious surface, the highest urban heat impacts and air pollution impacts. And so this needs to be front and center in our efforts moving forward. How do we engage communities in building new green spaces and addressing the challenges of the past? And we am present, and we are excited to have some keynote speakers tomorrow morning who will be sharing more about Richmond's story around this. Next slide. We also have some good news, which is that there's a lot of focus right now on trees as a climate solution from the international, national, state, and local scale, as well as new investments and policies by states and the federal government. We're excited in the Forest Service Urban and Community Forestry Program to have received an unprecedented level of funding through the Inflation Reduction Act, which will be rolling out over the next year through competitive grant programs available to everyone. So it's an exciting time for our field and for these efforts to get a boost of new investment. Next slide. So with that, I'm excited to wrap up and share the mic with a dear colleague, Earl Eutsler from District Department of Transportation. When I think about innovation in the field of urban forestry, I always think of DC leading the way with the most exciting new advances, from data to policy to funding solutions. So very excited to be kicking off our event with Earl and some stories from DC. So with that, I think I will hand it over. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Great. Hey, thank you, Julie. Good morning to everyone. And thanks to the organizers of this event for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to share a little bit about DC's story. First off, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Earl Eutsler. I'm the Associate Director for DDOT's Urban Forestry Division. I work alongside about 45 incredibly talented professionals who together care for the city's public trees directly, while also protecting our urban forest resources on private property through authorities I'll describe here in a moment. And I'm very pleased to be with you all here today. Next slide, please. Right, in this presentation, I'll give you a brief history of how Washington came to be known the City of Trees, a fascinating story in my opinion. I'll describe our tree ordinance and the funding stream it's created, as well as the partnerships and uses we've put into place. I'll also touch a little bit on the creation of our tree canopy goal and the important ways that has shaped how we and our partners allocate resources and monitor progress and outcomes. I'll share a quick case study that demonstrates our longstanding focus on achieving equitable access to urban forests. This has been, for us, a 15-year focus, and I'm personally and organizationally very proud that we have many successes and accomplishments in that arena. So I'll touch briefly on those. And then to build off of what Julie talked about, very quickly, I'll just describe the uniqueness of this moment across the Chesapeake Bay Watershed and hope that we can come together and use this event as a catalyst for action. Next slide, please. Okay, Washington, D.C. stands apart, in my opinion, from most other U.S. cities when it comes to trees. They're considered so essential that they were included as an integral part of Pierre L'Enfant's original design. This map, drafted in 1791, reserved space in the public rights of way exclusively for trees. One of the things I like about this historical image is that if you see the compass rose on the right side of the map, you'll notice that it has, it's describing the position of what we now call the US Capitol. He refers to it as the Congressional House here. But what's interesting is he notes the longitude as 0 degrees. And this is the first, not the last, but the first attempt to reorient the prime meridian to Washington, D.C., which is fascinating. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, L'Enfant's plan, which was characterized by very wide avenues and streets and included dedicated space for street trees, ended up being an ideal design for integrating forests into the city. This view is looking north along 16th Street Northwest from the White House. And the block just north of Lafayette Square is what we now refer to as Black Lives Matter Plaza. And I really like this image, which is from the mid-40s, because it shows that extensive public tree canopy extending as far as you can see north on 16th Street. Next slide, please. All right, in this image, looking east from the US Capitol with RFK Stadium in the background, shows the full promise of L'Enfant's plan, a built environment where trees dominate the city, or at least hold their own against all the buildings. Really remarkable view. Next slide, please. All right, well, following the Civil War, Washington was left in tatters, and L'Enfant's wide avenues remained unpaved and were frequently mocked for their grand emptiness by foreign visitors. The city was in such a state that there was actually serious talk about relocating the capital from Washington to St. Louis. So enter Alexander Boss Shepard, who was appointed as governor of Washington, D.C., and constructed the modern infrastructure we have across the city today. Fascinatingly, he convinced Congress to raise $6 million in the 1870s for these efforts and installed sidewalks, sewers, paved roads, and most relevant for us here today, installed 60,000 street trees. And it was through his efforts that Washington came to be known as the city of trees. Next slide, please. But there was only one problem. Despite an enormous budget for the time of $6 million, he ended up overspending 3 times as much. And he spent $18 million on this work. And he, in some ways, even concealed this overspending from Congress. So when it was finally uncovered and much of the work remained incomplete, he was essentially run out of the city after a brief but impactful stint here in DC. Next slide, please. So just quickly, not only did his efforts run substantially over budget, but he also went about his work in ways that alienated lots of people. For instance, he wanted to sort of moderate the terrain of what we think of as downtown DC. And so went through and regraded everything to be at more or less the same grade. And so people might leave for a congressional recess and come back and find their home looking like this when they return, which is just really staggering. But so I love this image because it shows sort of the tenacity of his pursuit of this vision for a modern Washington. But I also love, you can see several street trees planted in this image. So next slide, please. So 100 years after L'Enfant's plan and less than 20 years after Boss Shepard created modern Washington, street trees had become essential assets. They had taken, if you will. And I look at this map from 1891 as evidence that street trees as an asset had become institutionalized. This comes from a series of 12 statistical maps prepared for Congress on the infrastructure of the district, detailing things like street widths, paving surface, the presence of dimension of sewers, and the species of tree lining every city block. And I read it as the importance afforded to trees that of those 12 maps in the series, trees were labeled as number 4, 4 out of 12. And so here we have less than 20 years after Boss Shepard had set into motion these improvements, street trees have become institutionalized, and Washington, D.C. was firmly the city of trees. Next slide, please. Moving forward a decade, brings us to the McMillan Plan, which recognized again the critical role of trees in the city. Next slide. This plan created the National Mall as we know it today, as well as preserving the Civil War era forts encircling the city, what we now refer to as the Fort Circle Parks, excuse me. Next slide. Here's an excellent image looking west from the US Capitol across the modern mall. And we see L'Enfant's grand vision finally coming into proper focus. And interestingly, that statue in the foreground of the image is of Ulysses S. Grant, who as president actually hired Boss Shepard as governor of Washington, incidentally. So next slide. Jumping ahead another 100 years to 1999, we see Washington's status as the city of trees in jeopardy. DC Mayor Anthony Williams is standing in a park in Adams Morgan, referring to trees as a metaphor for how we care for our city and its population, stating, if we can't take care of our trees, how can we take care of our schools? While announcing an increased focus on addressing the city's declining urban forest resources. And in this article, he mentions the fact that for several years, no trees had been planted. There were thousands of dead standing trees and a backlog of 20,000 or more trees requiring routine maintenance and pruning. So the city's trees were in a very sad state. Next slide, please. And Anthony Williams was prompted into action by a now famous study from American Forests in 1999, documenting a staggering loss of tree canopy across the city. Now, this report was distilled down largely into this image, showing DC in 1973 and then contrasting it in 1997. And while the resolution was coarse by today's standard 30-meter pixel size, the decline was undeniable. And so it came to be referred to as the $50 million photo. Next slide, please. Because it spurred area philanthropist Betty Brown Casey to establish Casey Trees in 2001 with an initial donation of $50 million. And Casey Trees' mission is to restore, enhance, and protect the tree canopy of the nation's capital. And as you can well imagine, we're very grateful to call them close partners. Next slide. So the very next year, 2002, Mayor Williams established the Urban Forestry Division, the group that I lead and have worked in for nearly 20 years, and placed it within the newly created Department of Transportation. Next slide. So later that same year, the Urban Forest Preservation Act of 2002 was passed by the DC Council and signed into law by Mayor Williams. So at this point, more than 200 years had passed since L'Enfant laid out a bold vision for a young nation's capital, and the city once again affirmed its commitment to trees in the city. Next slide, please. So allow me to introduce this legislation briefly and explain the revenue stream that it's provided. Next slide. But it bears, despite all this history I've given you already, it bears putting this into a little additional historical context. You know, DC in 2002 was only just beginning to recover from years of municipal mismanagement and many other issues and problems. Its population, which had risen steadily since the improvements delivered by Boss Shepard between 1850 and more or less 1950, but the city from then on had been losing population for the subsequent 50 years until this current period of revitalization began around 2000. And when I look at this chart, this blue line charting the district's population since 1800 and plotting when this Urban Forest Preservation Act was passed into law, it strikes me as a fairly bold move to say, in addition to all the other needs we have as a city, we need to protect and preserve the tree canopy and urban forests of DC. And so it strikes me as a prescient move. And the city has since undergone a remarkable period of growth and population expansion. Next slide, please. So this law, which has been modified and amended nearly a dozen times since its initial passage, essentially protects and regulates the removal of special and heritage trees. And you can see these are described here on the screen. I won't read that for you. But basically, the law assesses a fee of $55 per inch of circumference for the removal of any non-hazardous special tree. So think healthy special tree. And a healthy heritage tree, those trees with a circumference of 100 inches or larger, simply cannot be removed. Lastly, any hazardous tree can be removed with a permit can be obtained without a fee of any sort. Next slide, please. So this law created a tree fund, and it the accepted revenue generated from the permitted removal of healthy special trees can be used in three ways. It can be used to administer the act, it can be used to plant replacement trees, and it can provide hazardous tree mitigation for income contingent homeowners, which has been a valuable program for people who have participated. Next slide, please. So this is a chart of tree fund contributions over the last 10 years. Hopefully it's large enough on your screen. We basically went from 2002 generating around $200,000 that year to more than $2 million in 2022. And I would suggest there are roughly two ways to interpret this slide showing this tree fund revenue over the last 10 years. The first is we seem to have a durable source of revenue that can be used to plant more trees. But the second is that it appears trees are being removed at accelerating rates. While we are receiving more permit applications than we did in 2012, the fee to remove healthy trees has also gone up. So it's not as alarming as it might appear. Next slide, please. So $2 million is a pretty substantial amount of money. So what are we doing with that? Well, I'm proud to describe the partnerships we've put in place with major partners such as the Department of Energy and Environment here in the city, as well as KC Trees. And there's a number of programs, DOE's River Smart Homes program, which is, I think, now around 15 years old and wildly successful, has a shade tree planting component. KC Trees runs numerous tree planting programs, community tree planting. They implement a tree rebate, plant many trees on schools and parks and across neighborhoods. And all of those planting programs and subsidies are now offered at no cost to district residents. And while the tree fund might not pay for 100% of all of those efforts, it pays for the majority and enables them to be delivered at no fee to the recipient, which is great. Additionally, we've used tree fund dollars to establish, in partnership with KC Trees, the DC State Nursery, which they're out at their farm in Berryville, Virginia. They're growing thousands of trees for the city annually, which are then being returned to DC and planted as street trees and park trees as part of our tree planting program. And then any tree fund dollars that remain in a given year, we use to augment and increase the number of trees we're planting on public lands. We're planting, in a typical year, 8,000 trees across the city. Next slide, please. So that's the overview of our legislation and the funding stream it's created and the partnerships we have in place to help ensure that these dollars are going towards replacement trees all across the city. And I want to touch briefly on our canopy goal. So next slide, please. So this, in my opinion, this sort of follows in the footsteps of all the historical information I shared earlier about DC becoming and remaining the city of trees, because in 2011, the city established an urban tree canopy goal seeking to achieve 40% urban tree canopy by 2032. And currently we're at roughly 37.5% tree canopy. And why I want to bring this up is it relates to some of the comments Julie made at the introduction about the bay-wide land cover data that exists. And I credit this urban tree canopy goal with compelling us and our partners to perform land cover assessments at regular intervals, assess the resources we have, identify where opportunities are greatest, prioritize those with where the opportunity is greatest, and then monitor the outcomes and measure our progress. How are our policies working? How are our programs moving the needle on this? And so I'm happy to say we've done studies in 2006, 2011, 2015, and most recently in 2020. And I'm happy to say that since 2006, we have a net increase of 425 acres, although between 2015 and 2020, we did see a decline in certain substantial decline in certain parts of the city. Next slide, please. So I said at the beginning that I wanted to describe how we became the city of trees, give an overview of our legislation, the funding stream it created, talk about our canopy goal, and then share a case study about how we've managed to pursue and in many cases achieve tree equity across the city. So next slide, please. Washington, D.C. is really a case study in extremes. If we look simply at median values of public health and various outcomes and demographic information, you might think that on balance, the city is doing well overall. For instance, we have a much higher median household income than the national average. But that obscures the fact that DC is actually a place where there isn't a middle. In essence, we have a poverty rate approaching 20%, and we have more than 14% of district residents living on less than $15,000 annually. And yet this median household income is substantially above the national average. And I share this image here from DC's Health Equity Report in 2018, because it highlights the place-based nature of these disparities across the district. And Julie was talking about how we know that if across the Bay watershed, our tree canopy is not necessarily distributed equitably, and not everyone has a chance to participate and benefit from all that urban trees have to offer. Next slide, please. And so the DC Health Equity Report is really quite fascinating. I'd be happy to point you to it, or you can find it on your own. But it all sort of spools up to this one tragic conclusion, which is there's as much as a 21-year difference in life expectancy based on where you live, where you were born. And the report makes several really, I think, key insights. Health is more than healthcare. Health inequities aren't natural and they are not inevitable. And then the point that I think motivates and animates some of our work is that all policy can become health policy. And it's through that lens, next slide, please, that we've taken our approach to prioritizing where our planting resources can be deployed and best used. And so this is a map on the left in blue of where we've received tree planting requests in the last 5 years, contrasted with the map in green on the right of where we've deployed these resources in that same period. And this is for the last 5 years. These trends hold for more than a decade now. But in essence, the lighter the color, the fewer the requests or the fewer number of trees planted. The darker the color, the more demand or the more trees delivered. And so what you see here are some interesting correlations and overlap between where we have the greatest disparities in income or in educational attainment or tragically in life expectancy. That overlaps with where we have some of the least demand for public tree planting programs. And so using both our land cover assessments that we've been doing since 2006, as well as our inventory on the ground, we've been able to identify not just where people are asking us to plant public trees, but also where there's the greatest opportunity for them. Next slide, please. And so if we look here in the past 10 years, this chart is showing the net number of trees, the net number of additional trees in each of the 8 wards across the city in the green bars. And you can see every ward has received, we've grown the public trees in each ward by no fewer than 2,000 trees, and in some places by more than 7,000 trees. And the blue line is charting the relative percent increase in that ward. And if we look in Ward 8, which is one of the areas with our most under-resourced and overburdened populations, you can see we've achieved a 57% increase in the number of public trees in that ward directly. And that's through leveraging the land cover assessments, our own tree inventory, and then bringing the partnerships I mentioned earlier to address this problem and doing it for a sustained period of time. Next slide, please. You'll see more images like this later, but I wanted to drop it up here because this is Oxen Run Park, and this just shows, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with these types of images. It helps us understand where is it possible for us to plant trees, and where is it possible for us to plant trees immediately, and that's what's shown in pink here. Next slide, please. So one of the neighborhoods in that image I just showed earlier is the Wheeler Creek community, and this I wanted to focus in on this because it really captures the effectiveness of this approach, I think, in helping deliver tree equity to all residents. So this is Waller Court in 2005, the first year or the last year before our first land cover study was performed. And I mean, it's really, I lived here and worked here at this time, but it's hard for me to even remember that there were parts of DC that looked like this back then. Next slide, please. Because using the approach I detailed here a moment ago of identifying where opportunities were greatest and then prioritizing and allocating our resources to meet those needs, we're able to come back and by 2009 had planted all of the public space areas in this community. Next slide. And so then if we fast forward another decade to 2019, you can see the remarkable transformation this neighborhood has blown up with tree canopy and is, I mean, to me, that's just stunning and spectacular. And I hope provides sort of a brief, concentrated example of how this can work. And something that our team is really proud of. I will point out that we just looked at a 15-year progression. And so this work takes time. So that's why I'm gonna ask for the next slide and wrap up on, sorry, one more. Wrap up on this, whoops, yeah, right there, please. Wrap up on this point. We have right now, between the IRA funding that is in the process of being either released directly to you and your states or made available for direct application here in the near future, combined with this Chesapeake Bay wide land cover data, we now have all of the tools for communities of every size to identify where these needs are greatest, prioritize those communities who stand to benefit the most, and deploy these resources in informed and meaningful ways to move the needle and improve tree equity across our watershed. So I'll look forward to seeing all of you in subsequent presentations and in the chat. Next slide, please. This is my email address. If there are any or other information, I'd be absolutely happy to answer or provide you that information. So I want to thank everyone again for your time and attention, and I look forward to talking with you again here soon.
Thank you so much, Earl, for that wonderful presentation. Very insightful. It's super helpful. And I think a lot of folks echoed that in the chat to get a really practical idea of what it looks like to institute policies that link, the three themes that we're talking about today, right? Link climate resilience, link tree loss reduction, and equity, right? And to be able to see the impact of that coordinated work in one jurisdiction, in a focused manner over time. You and your team have done such a great job of actually measuring the work that counts most, right? Which is getting the trees where they're needed most, getting them maintained, and easing the task of doing so for folks who are living with in under-resourced conditions. And so thank you again, Earl, for your great presentation. We are excited to keep the conversation going with our next panel. And so our next panel, the presentation is about branching out, how to leverage climate goals to achieve tree canopy outcomes. So we're going to continue the conversation in the climate space, and we're going to talk resilience, and we're going to also talk about how tree goals, how maybe you can get some ideas for advancing your tree goals, not just in DC, but of course across the entire Watershed. And so in this session, you'll hear from several states about their ambitious tree canopy and climate pledges, their plans and policies. The goal here is to highlight opportunities to integrate climate and tree canopy solutions, which are, of course, naturally related and mutually reinforcing. And so if we design well, the thought is we can leverage our overarching climate plans to achieve our tree goals. And so we have some great speakers joining us, Rachel Lamb out of the Maryland Department of Environment, who will be sharing a little bit more about their Tree Solutions Now Act. Very excited to hear more about that. Mark McPherson out of City Forest Credits, talking about urban forest carbon credit certification. Beth Krumrine, who is with the Delaware Division of Climate and Coastal and Energy out of their Natural Resources Department. So looking forward to hearing hearing from Beth about the Tree for Every Delawarean initiative. And then we'll also hear from Molly Hassett out of the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, who will be sharing a little bit more about New York's Climate Act and how that work is advancing New York's tree goals. And so do continue to put your questions, comments in the chat. We will actually have a little bit of time for Q&A at the close of this session. So please do type your questions in the chat, and we'll see as many as we can get to at the close of all of the panelists' presentations. So with that, I will turn it over to Rachel to kick us off.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks so much for the invitation to share more about all that Maryland is doing on both climate action and integrating trees within our climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. So I work here in the Office of the Secretary to support natural climate solutions across the board, and am the agency's lead on our 5 Million Trees initiative. So next slide, please. So I think it's helpful to first understand where Maryland has come from on the climate conversation. In 2009, we passed the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, which set ambitious short-term and medium-term greenhouse gas reduction goals. Just like many other states, in order to reach your goal, you have to have a plan. And so we developed a 2012 plan to achieve our 2020 goal, which we exceeded. And then just recently published our 2030 goal, which was to achieve a 40% reduction in emissions from our 2006 baseline by 2030. However, in the last year, we had some exciting legislation passed, the Climate Solutions Now Act, which made Maryland goals revised. And now we have a new challenge of reaching a 60% reduction in emissions by 2031 and a new net zero goal by 2045. This kind of emissions reduction target makes Maryland the most ambitious of any state in terms of near-term goals. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about greenhouse gas targets, it's important to clarify that there's both gross emissions and then net emissions. And this is relevant for our discussion today about trees, because on the gross emissions side, you see some of those initial targets reaching 25% reductions by 2020, 60% by 2031. That's really focusing at reducing emissions at their sources, transportation, electricity, et cetera. When we're talking about a net goal, that means we start to include our carbon sinks, especially our land areas where on a net basis, they're capturing more and removing more carbon from the atmosphere than they're emitting. And so by including a dynamic, those dynamic changes in our sinks, like you can see on the green bars that are sort of a negative number, that's how we're going to get to net zero. So continuing to reduce emissions at their source, but then increasing the value and the size of our sinks so that we can benefit, not only for a mitigation, but as we've, many on the call already know, a resilient land base is important for continuing to navigate all the changes we're experiencing. So next slide. So because we have a net zero goal, this really puts front and center our natural working lands. So trees, forests, agricultural soils, and also blue carbon systems in our state like wetlands or seagrasses. All of our efforts around natural and working land should be included consistently across all of the state's assessment and planning tools. So like many states and cities, we have an emissions inventory that helps us understand net changes from year to year. We have a plan to help us scale activities and ambition to help make sure we're on track to achieve those targets that we set. Progress tracking helps us understand whether or not we're actually implementing activity in the way that we thought relative to our plan. And of course, we want to make sure that we're always positioned to include improved science and technologies that help us better understand these changes and sometimes unpredictable and a little bit more complicated ways. So I'm going to just talk briefly about how trees are already included across all three of these assessment and planning tools, and then frame up why the Tree Solutions Now Act is particularly exciting against this backdrop. Next slide, please. All right, so our 2030 plan outlines a series of projections that are moving from a qualitative assessment that trees can be good for climate to a quantitative assessment. How much more carbon do we think we can get by when, if we are successful at implementing our tree and forest restoration, conservation, improved management strategies. So here is just an example of a table where our partner and sister agency, the Department of Natural Resources, outlines a series of strategies, again, focused on management improvements, looking at how we can plant more forests or increase urban tree canopy, and how we can do more to avoid conversion due to land use stressors. And then you'll see that depending on, again, the existing state and federal programs, the potential scale of implementation, how much more carbon do we think we can get by when? This was recently, can go to the next slide, please. This was recently evaluated in our progress report, which we published last year. Again, looking at these initial targets that we set for 2030 and asking how well are we doing? And this is really focused on activity implementation. So our inventory, which I'll talk about in a second, is actually looking at the carbon impact related to that activity. This is actually saying how many acres, how many trees are going in the ground. And of course, as was already highlighted earlier, the activity that we're reporting here should be overlapping pretty well with the activity that we're reporting up to the Chesapeake Bay program to, again, make sure that we're driving efficiencies and leveraging improvements in data across the board. So here we have kind of a lot of change that's happening over time, depending on funding, investment, capacity, partnerships with local landowners. And again, looking at both how we can increase that for 2030, and now in the context of our new goals, how we could even do more than this. So next slide, please. I'm very proud that Maryland is the first state in the nation to adopt a remote sensing-based forest carbon inventory. This is really valuable because we're able to actually track changes across the landscape in a spatially explicit way, meaning that we can see not only where tree change is happening, where you see regrowth or you see loss due to disturbance of all sorts, natural and human cause, but we can also begin to understand the why behind the changes that we're seeing due to things like changes in weather, changes that trees and growth rates that trees are having due to increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. All of these kind of complicated drivers of change help emphasize, as you can see here, that our sink is not static. So increasing tree cover can be really one driver of trying to increase and realize the carbon potential of the landscape. But it's also helpful to put that in conversation with other drivers and kind of ask, are we on track to achieve what we're going to need to achieve to reach net zero by 2045? Or are there some other strategies that we need to adopt, like improved management or building more healthier, resilient forests to help try to navigate some of these indirect human impacts? So next slide, please. All right, so we couldn't do this without close partnerships with a range of organizations, agencies, universities to make sure that we're leveraging improved and advanced science to help us do this. So as is true for the high resolution land use land cover data that we heard about earlier, LiDAR data is really important because carbon related to tree canopy stocks and changes relate a lot to the structure of those trees. So LiDAR helps us understand changes in structure And we can use that in the context of an ecosystem model to be able to evaluate, again, the related carbon impact to the structural changes that we're seeing on the landscape. We can also use those same ecosystem models to project how much more carbon we can get by planting trees across the landscape. And we know that that carbon benefit isn't the same everywhere. So we need to make sure that we have tools that can help us assess those differences as one way of trying to target priority areas for increased investment. And then, of course, we're tracking changes over time. So to do that, we need, again, remote sensing based instruments to do that. And we're tracking those changes annually. And you can kind of see that featured in the bottom right-hand kind of panel to make sure we're seeing as best as possible where losses and gains are occurring. Next slide, please. All right, so against this ongoing investment in trees for helping to achieve our climate mitigation goals, the 2021 General Assembly passed the Tree Solutions Now Act, which said that we need to do increasingly more to plant trees in particular places. And so they asked us to plant 5 million additional native trees by 2031. So those are largely speaking additional to all of the existing commitments I showed you in our 2030 Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act plan. And importantly, these trees need to go in places where there are particular benefits for people in local communities. And so at least 10% of them, or 500,000 trees, must be planted in urban underserved areas as defined by the legislation. Next slide. So in order to do this, it's going to take a lot of folks to get 5 million more trees in the ground. So my agency is the lead coordinating entity to help manage the data, the tracking, the coordination. But we are really needing to partner with a range of implementing agencies to do this well. So there is strong leadership support on this initiative from our sister agencies in natural resources and agriculture, Maryland Department of Transportation, as well as a significant investment, particularly in urban tree planting from the Chesapeake Bay Trust. So all of the monies, which is about $15 million per year through 2031, is largely going to get trees in the ground, and not only to make sure that they're planted, but that they're maintained and managed over time. I like to say we're in the business of growing healthy trees, not just planting them. And so this requires a lot of programmatic strategy to not only design programs to reach a variety of different landowners who might have different capacities and skill sets, but do more partnering with a range of additional local, private organizations to make sure that, again, we're building skills capacity to not only get the trees, but maintain them over time. Next slide, please. All right, so one thing we're really excited about is a new tree tracking and registration tool that we're should be launching in the next month. And what this is really important for taking the tree data that we are managing under our 5 million trees goal and making sure that it makes sense and counts with our climate goals. So one of the challenges anyone has in tree planting and tree restoration, at least for tracking with remote sensing, I should say, is that it's very hard to see small scale tree plantings. It's hard to detect them over time. You have to figure out, is it a tree? Is it you know, a scrub? Like how do we know that it's not only there, but it's being maintained and it's healthy? And so what we are working on right now in partnership with our NASA and the University of Maryland is making sure that all the data that is getting reported to us from all of our private planting partners, from all of our state agencies, is captured transparently so people can see where the trees are going. And then we use that data to estimate the related carbon benefits in a consistent way with our current inventory strategy. And then it opens up a lot more opportunity to ask about long-term assessment. How do we know those trees are there into the future? And it lets field data help verify and be put in conversation with top-down data from remote sensing. And this whole strategy is just one of many that are highlighted in our state's final plan for growing 5 million trees in Maryland. So both the science data tracking complemented with the programmatic strategy to make sure that we're leveraging these new monies in a way that, again, makes sense on the ground. Next slide, please. We're also very proud that the state was able to leverage this 5 million trees goal as a commitment towards the 1 trillion trees initiative. So Maryland, like Delaware and other states, have done this. And I think what it's opened up lines of opportunity for additional partnership around communities of practice. So we have a range of supporting actions that's going to help us reach this carbon mitigation goal, including many that you can see here. I've talked extensively about data and technology tools, but also how we think about market innovation, workforce development, sustainable management. How do these things all work together to make sure that by 2030 we have healthy, resilient forests and urban trees? Next slide. I wanted to emphasize 2 more things here as I wrap up. But in addition to planning, policy, assessment, we also continually need to think about ways that state funding can be leveraged to attract additional investment. One of the groundbreaking laws that passed last year in the state was the Maryland Conservation Finance Act. This legislation is really critical because it opened up new lines of financing and investment in the state through a pay for success or a pay for performance model. So this legislation is really looking to bring additional monies into the state from private investment by centering the state, for example, as a buyer of carbon outcomes. So we're all very familiar with a grant-based model where maybe the state, for example, is paying for a project using grant monies. The project developer then, implements the project, and then you find a way to sort of report what you think the outcomes of the grant project were. This model sort of flips that in its head, and what it does is it says the state will buy the quantified and verified carbon outcomes, regardless of who funds them. But by showing that you will buy the outcomes, private investors see that as an opportunity. And so they can work directly with project developers to finance the cost of getting trees in the ground, maintaining and managing them over time. Then those project developers do the work, and then those outcomes then are the commodity that gets sold to the state. And this is, the state doesn't always have to be the buyer. Sometimes we're the financer, but there's a lot of opportunity here to expand workforce development and maybe the types of project development that can then occur, not having to overly depend on grant funding, and again, brings more money in to complement state and federal funding. And we spent some time outlining what the state's framework for engagement with carbon markets is in our final plan. So I encourage you to also check that out for more information. My last point here on the final slide here is just to emphasize that we're really excited about all of the opportunities that are coming down through of course, the monies from the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I think it's really critical when we have a range of amazing partners coming to the table to ask how we can strategically use these funds, that they can be connected to where there's existing energy, where there's existing structures, assessment tools, planning already happening. And so we're really working hard internally to coordinate, and also increasingly in conversation with our local partners to figure out how we can use these monies from the America the Beautiful Challenge, of course, all the opportunities coming from Urban and Community Forestry Program, a range of USDA focused projects to think about new ways to get trees in the ground in some of our agricultural contexts. And then again, because there's a benefit of trees for carbon and climate, there's actually an opportunity that the state has to name and quantify and describe the additional carbon benefits that trees have towards our reduction goals, explicitly name that in our planning, and that opens up billions of dollars of implementation money that can be used from this other line, for example, through the EPA to support tree planting. So lots of opportunity, lots of ongoing discussion. And I think it's just emphasizes the value of a roundtable like this to see where we can continue making connections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that awesome, very comprehensive presentation. It sounds like Maryland is attacking from all sides the challenge of growing, like you said, growing healthy tree canopy coverage statewide. And it's inspiring to hear all of the work that you all are doing. So kudos to you all. And yeah, and on that note of leveraging private investment, right, to complement the state and federal investments that we're all trying to make the most of at the moment. Our next speaker, Mark McPherson with City Forest Credits, knows a little bit about how to leverage that funding. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, Mark, to tell us a little bit more.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. Well, carbon is important, but anyone involved in urban forestry knows that carbon is only one of many benefits of the urban forest. And yet, what's interesting is the carbon markets that have been out there for 25 plus years have left urban forestry completely out. So there's been no opportunity for companies to invest in their own backyard to help to green some of these overburdened communities, to achieve greater tree equity, and to reverse what is essentially deforestation in our cities nationally. And in our view, what could be a better carbon credit than an urban forest credit? Because in our case, currently, we are crediting only trees planted in public property. So it's a public resource planted for a public benefit with the impacts delivered directly to people. And the implementing parties are local governments and nonprofit organizations. So it's not the usual case in the carbon world where you have a lot of, private landowners and you have a lot of for-profit carbon developers. This is really the ultimate public interest credit. Next slide, please. So here's one slide that kind of actually gives you the highest level summary as possible. We're a nonprofit organization, and the two goals are high quality projects and new carbon revenue, or a goal that I think we all share, which is greener, healthier, more equitable cities. And of course, this will empower companies to put their money right into their own backyards to deliver benefits directly to people. Next slide, please. So I have only 10 minutes. This is going to necessarily be a very quick sprint through carbon crediting, which is a complicated topic. But there are many foundational elements to carbon crediting. One are the so-called protocols. Protocols are rule books, really, that projects have to follow in order to earn the credits. And we put together a national group of scientists and urban forest professionals all around the country to develop these rule books for carbon crediting. We have one for afforestation, reforestation, essentially planting, and we have one very important for tree preservation. And it's interesting, I think Chesapeake Bay is unusual in the collaboration between the tree preservation people and the planting people. Nationally, that's not really the case. The urban forest people tend to focus more in the more urbanized areas and focus on planting. The preservation is usually done by land trusts and conservancies who often don't really talk to the urban forest people that much. But preserving forested stands is very important. Some people say it's going to be difficult to plant our way out of urban tree loss. So preserving these forested stands is very important. Next slide, please. So one of the things we did early on is we recognized that we needed to articulate in this credit the value of the urban forest credit. So one of the things I asked our lead scientist, who happened to be my older brother, Greg McPherson, he was a longtime scientist for the U.S. Forest Service. Can we build other values into the carbon credit? Carbon credit is a metric ton of CO2. That's a standardized unit the world over. Can we build in other values? So Greg and his team said, well, yes, we can build in rainfall interception, air quality, and energy savings in resource units and avoided costs. So that's great. All of a sudden, we have a credit that is very different than almost any other forest-based credit, because we can quantify the ecosystem values and build them into the credit. Next slide, please. So the whole other part of urban forest impacts are the social impacts. These are much more difficult to quantify, and in a way, right now, you can't really say that we can quantify ahead of time what the benefits are of a project, but we can describe those social impacts. And we've spent a lot of time at City Forest Credits developing a whole framework for assessing social impacts of projects. So we've developed with scientists and iteration through a number of different projects, 60 different impacts and indicators for social equity and human health. These are all mapped through to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, so projects can report directly under those, under that framework, because many companies report under the SDGs. Next slide, please. So again, very quick, we now have 36 projects around the country. These run the gamut from a 3-acre restoration of a public space next to public housing facility in Shoreline, Washington, preservation projects by a city and the county, King County in Washington State, to natural areas plantings in Austin, Texas. They have a lot of water quality, water quantity issues. So they decided to focus on riparian reforestation there. That's much more like a sort of a natural area reforestation. Tree equity project in Providence, Rhode Island, preservation projects really all over, a mix in Chicago of both preservation and planting, preservation project in Pittsburgh and in the Cleveland area. Next slide, please. So here's a quick slide on how it works. Let's say you are a local operator, and by that I mean you want to develop a tree project. So if you follow the arrow from the local operator at the bottom to the left, you'll see it says plants or protects trees, follows protocols, and that goes to city forest credits. So you have to follow our protocols in your planning and protection. We then validate that if it meets our validation standards, and this is all discussed well ahead of time, so there's not a surprise when this happens, then the project has to be third-party verified. So those are independent verifiers who come in to verify that this project is eligible and it meets all of our many requirements in the protocol. If it does, we issue credits back to the local operator. The local operator sells the credits to a buyer. The money flows from the buyer to the local operator. We charge a fee for our work, but again, we're a nonprofit, so we're not in this to leverage money for ourselves. The goal is to deliver that funding back to the local operators who can put that money into more trees, more communities. Next slide, please. One quick slide on urban area definition. Some people ask, is it urban? Are you only in the downtown cores? Our location definition includes city boundaries. It also includes the Census Bureau urban areas, and it also includes MPO or municipal planning organization boundaries. Now, in a state like Maryland, which tends to be more urbanized, the MPO boundaries, as you can see, comprise a good chunk of the land area of Maryland. And that's for the simple reason that it's not just what happens in cities, it is what is happening as cities grow, and what are the land use patterns and the urban forest patterns in and around cities. So the eligibility areas are pretty large, particularly for a state like Maryland. Next slide, please. Okay, quick slide on planting projects. I mentioned high quality projects, and they're high quality simply because with carbon crediting, you can't just stick some trees in the ground and keep them there for a few years and walk away. You have to have accountability, longevity, and you have to have reported impacts. So projects have to make a 26-year commitment to the project, and you have to sample or calculate a sample of the trees and either visit those trees to check mortality or conduct measurement of DBH at 4 different time periods. In the planning protocol, the credits are based on forecasted carbon storage over 26 years. So this sampling at these intervals is very important to make sure a project is on track and make sure that the credits issued are tracking the actual growth in the trees. And of course, as I said earlier, the ecosystem and the social impacts are all reported throughout this. Now, to some people, these commitments you have to make are intimidating and burdensome. And it's true, it costs more money to obtain credits on the trees. And it depends on the project, whether that investment of that extra cost is worth it. That partly depends on the revenue. I'll have a comment at the end about the IRA, because with IRA funding, that could cover a lot of the costs of adding the carbon crediting to your project. Next slide, please. Here's just one example. And again, we now have 36. So there are many, many projects to talk about, but this is just one. This happens to be in Minneapolis. The Park and Recreation Board has a planting project. And this is a very large project for urban, particularly for street trees. This is 23,000 trees. Credits are issued over 4 different intervals. That was a prior version of our protocol. And the little table there just gives you an idea of the projected credit revenue. So year 1, 10% of the credits are issued. That's $34 a credit. That's actually what our credits in 2020 sold for, was $34 a ton. And then year 3, there's another batch issued. Year 5, another batch issued. Year 26, depending on the carbon that's actually measured at that time, there's another batch issued. We put $100 a credit as a forecast in 26 years. I will say that the EU carbon credits right now sell for almost $100 a ton, right now in 2022, 2023. So $100 is probably undershooting. And you should probably also know that the projections are that the demand for natural-based carbon credits is going to vastly exceed the supply of those credits. So there's going to be upward price pressure on the credits. Next slide, please. Now, preservation projects, again, these are really important projects. These are forested stands of trees that are there that are not currently protected, and where there is some threat of development or conversion of that out of forestry. And the project action here is to essentially protect the trees. That's done either by acquiring the land and imposing some kind of deed restriction that protects the trees for a minimum of 40 years, or through some kind of easement or covenant that protects the trees for that duration. If the preservation area is less than 50 acres, the credits are issued in year 1, and then they're phased in over up to 5 years, depending on the size of the parcel. Next slide. Here's a project, just an example. This is a city just outside Seattle. This is 15 acres. A developer owned it. A developer wanted to develop it. And essentially, the city came in with a whole stack of conservation financing to try to acquire this property. They did preserve it from development. The carbon crediting was an important part of that. And maybe what's most eye-popping are the quantified co-benefits of this project over 40 years. So these forested stands are just incredibly valuable. Also, this is land that was privately owned. It's now open to public access. So you have a whole nother equity component to this because it's now accessible to vast populations in and around Seattle. Next slide, please. One slide now on the sales side. So the projects, the credits belong to the projects. They're theirs to sell. They can sell them to whomever they please. In 2021, all of the projects that received credits that year came together and aggregated their credits and sold them in one large bundle to one buyer. That was an efficiency gain for all of them because in some cases, many of them didn't know how to sell credits. So to pool their credits and offer them in one portfolio of credits that is a huge rainbow tapestry of environmental and social impacts is a pretty powerful tool. The $34 a ton that sold for, that is more than double the price of a rural forest credit. So it's wonderful to see the market recognizing the value of these urban trees. The 2022 credits have just aggregated their credits. They're now kind of finishing the last bit of third-party verification. That is now 60,000 tons, so it's almost double the volume of 2021. Some projects are free to opt out of the national sale. If they have a local buyer who's connected, they're welcome to sell to them. Okay, I think that's it. The last slide, Sarah, and I'll be very quick. The IRA is here. And in our view, the IRA is a tremendous opportunity. The money's going to come and it's going to get spent relatively quickly. But we want to have trees there for a long time. And so one way to do that is to leverage that IRA money by putting some of that into carbon projects that, again, require that additional cost, but have that longevity and have that really high quality. So these projects have to be tracked and have to be maintained, but that's really what we all want at bottom with urban forestry. So thank you very much, Sarah, and all of you.
Thanks, Mark. Really great questions for you in the chat. We're looking forward to getting into those at the close of the panel. And great insights, creative financing mechanisms are so critical for the long-term expansion and investment in the quality of our urban forests and so in our community forests. So thank you for your work on that. Very excited to hear about what's going on in Delaware, in the state of Delaware, zooming in on the Trees for Every Delawarean and initiative, the program there. Looking forward to hearing from you, Beth, about how Delaware is translating its climate goals into tree canopy enhancement and expansion. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much and good morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Beth Krumrine. I'm a principal planner with the Delaware's Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. And I work in the Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy, and I lead the sustainability team. So today my focus is going to be on trees as they relate to addressing climate change, specifically in Delaware. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when we look at climate change throughout the world, it's going to look differently depending on where you are in the world. In some places, it is going to get hot and dry. And in other places, like here in Delaware, we are going to be swimming in water. Projections show that we will see not only increases in temperature, but also a lot more rain, heavier precipitation events. And when you combine that with sea level rise, and the sea level rise projection in Delaware is going to be substantial, we have a lot of challenges that we need to overcome here in Delaware. Next slide, please. So in planning for Delaware's future, in 2021, we developed the Delaware Climate Action Plan, which identified things that we can do to try to combat and have solutions for climate change. As part of that, we're going to be not only combating emissions reduction, but we're going to be looking at sustainability practices as well. So a while back, I believe it was in 2017, Delaware set a goal through the U.S. Climate Alliance of emission reduction of at least 26% from 2005 levels by 2025. As you know, the U.S. and the worldwide goal is net zero by 2025. So this climate action plan set the stage for having a goal. Word has it that we may hopefully soon be in Maryland's situation where something is adopted this year. I believe legislators are speaking with my division, so this is good news, and we will hope to see something passed this year. Next slide, please. So Delaware's Climate Action Plan emphasizes not only minimizing greenhouse gas emissions, but maximizing resiliency to climate change. So we are really emphasizing employing solar and wind, energy efficiency, and we have a lot of funding and a lot of initiatives that we're sinking into transportation. When it comes to resiliency and climate change impacts, infrastructure in Delaware is going to be of utmost importance. Of course, because of the sea level rise, we need to think about roadways coming up. DelDOT is putting a lot of work into that, but also planning initiatives at the town level for a more sustainable future. This includes natural and working lands. Next slide, please. Natural and working lands are natural systems that we depend, and they're essential for communities, economies, and ecosystems. Some examples can include ag lands, wetlands, forest lands, urban green spaces, and absolutely, yes, trees. Next slide, please. So when we think about climate in Delaware, we need to also think about the Delaware greenhouse gas inventory, and trees play an important role in that as well. And again, very similar to Maryland, we have a similar system in place. We have a greenhouse gas inventory, which looks at overall greenhouse gas emissions in the state. This initiative is led by the DNREC Division of Air Quality. Remember, I'm in the Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy, so we have multiple divisions working on this initiative. And there were many tools used to collect and analyze the data, but the basis of it is looking at carbon sources versus carbon sinks. Next slide, please. In Delaware, the major carbon sources are 30% transportation, 25% electric, 24% industrial. And the carbon sinks are Delaware's plants and trees that uptake and store carbon through photosynthesis. And there are, believe it or not, a lot of trees still remaining in Delaware, and we're trying to find mechanisms right now by which to protect them and continue to protect the wetlands. Next slide, please. And so when we look at all of the natural and working lands, this is based on the 2017 land use land cover data. There on the left, you can see all of the natural and working lands, and on the right, you can see them broken out by type, where deciduous forest is one category. But as a whole, all of those represent approximately 5.1% of carbon offsets in Delaware's greenhouse gas inventory. Next slide, please. So as we work toward, well, even though it's not an official goal, as we work toward achieving the US goal and the worldwide goal of net zero by 2050, we need to ensure that those existing carbon sinks remain intact. We are working in trying to figure out first of all, what is being lost, how much is being lost, and how do we work to preserve that through legislation. Specifically, right now, we've identified tree removal as being of great concern in certain areas in the state. So we need to make sure that that 5.1% continues to be 5.1% and not less. And at the same time, we want to expand and enhance the NWLs, which also include trees in Delaware, to increase those carbon sinks. And that can be not just planting, but maintenance is a huge consideration, because you want to have healthy trees and healthy ecosystems that can uptake carbon to the maximum capacity. Next slide, please. So we have identified in the Climate Action Plan many best management practices. These are just a tiny few of them, but I do welcome you, if you're interested, to look at the Climate Action Plan. It is available on our website. So some of the things that can be done is to implement riparian buffers, avoiding land conversion, converting land into developments, and while we're planting, to incorporate native species. And looking forward into the future, think about, when planting trees, what species can be planted that might be a little more heat tolerant. These zones are starting to change, if you've noticed. Here in Dover, for example, sugar maples were once widely up and down the streets. They are now dead. So the zones of the plants, the zones of the trees are changing. So we want to not just plant more trees, but we're thinking very carefully about the temperature tolerances of those trees, and also the water needs and disease tolerance as well. So we work very closely with the Delaware Forest Service in making plans moving forward. Next slide, please. So we have a couple of goals in the works. The one that we can call it the statewide initiative is the Tree for Every Delawarean initiative, also called TEDdy, where the goal is to plant 1 million trees by 2030. So the idea is that there is one tree for every Delawarean, because there's a population of 1 million. Please don't take that literally. People are now waiting to be handed their individual seedling. We're like, well, that was a conceptual idea. So also in conjunction with that, we want to mention Delaware's state pledge of planting 1 million trees through 1T.org. And that is an initiative headed by the Delaware Forest Service. Next slide, please. So the Tree for Every Delawarean initiative was a very unique program, which was launched at the governor's level in 2021 by John Carney. And this was a unique program in that we have 2 agencies that have teamed up together to launch the program and to run the program. Very unique situation. So it's my program, which is DENREC's Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy, and also the Delaware Forest Services Urban and Community Forestry Program. Next slide, please. We have been collaborating a lot to talk about what resources are needed for the public. So we developed a website, which is a one-stop shop for the public. We have resources for tree plantings, selection, care, volunteer and training opportunities, and the Teddy Tree Tracker and app, and I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. Next slide, please. So we developed a tracking app. Well, it's an app, and it can be used on your website, either on your phone or on the computer. And it's a platform collecting tree planting numbers. We wanted to develop something that the public could use, and also that we could enter data from NGOs and other partners. So we had to think about this very carefully before we even developed it. This represents an up-to-date map of all tree plantings in the state, not just those funded through Teddy. So the Tree for Every Delawarean initiative does have grant programs that we give out every year. So the tracker includes those plantings and plantings from our partners. And additionally, we have a counter. Next slide, please. So we will see 3 different categories, and there's a reason for this. The one, which is organized plantings, are typically large-scale plantings. It includes all state agency plantings and NGO plantings. We secretly shipped to these organizations a link that they enter the data, and they can upload pictures, they can highlight their project, and this is going to be shown on the map. Some examples, we include data from all around the state. Delaware Center for Horticulture, Mount Cuba Center, Delaware Nature Society, Master Naturalists, Delaware Botanic Gardens, Delaware Wildlands, Center for Inland Bays, Nature Conservancy. You see the picture, it's everybody. And also Delaware Division of Parks and Recreation, Delaware Division of Fish and Wildlife. It is a lot. And then we screen those. But we wanted our partners, we call them all Teddy partners, to be able to showcase their projects. And these are usually where you're seeing a lot of the tree numbers, the 60,000 plant, they're probably seedlings. Now, also, when you get to the website, you will be able to see a place where the public can enter a tree. That was a different survey that was developed. So you're seeing 3 individual applications developed on survey 1, 2, 3, 2 of which we hang on to and we keep really quiet. The 3rd in the green, independent planting, is the one we link to the website, which then allows homeowners to enter their tree data. They can put a picture up. We are very careful. It's Delaware, so we can screen these regularly without being inundated, unlike other states who have attempted to do this. Data management has not been horrible. As you know, Delaware has only 3 counties, so it's a lot more manageable for us. And the last category is private plantings, and these are not shown on the map because of our ag stakeholders. We have a lot of farmers who may not want to have their information displayed publicly, and that's not a problem. So we just enter that as a tree number and call it good. Next slide, please. So this is the website. Excuse me, there's a way that you can click on it. This is just a screen capture, but you can click on and expand this. And on the far right is where an individual can enter their tree. I'm amazed that 780 people in Delaware have entered trees, or that there are 781 trees logged. That tells us that we are getting out there, and we have some pretty good outreach initiatives. And at this point, we have a lot of tree plantings in the works. We have funding, last year's funding, and we have a nice chunk of funding that we anticipate for next year for tree plantings that will augment these numbers. Teddy was developed to augment existing programs, not replace. And that's really what I want to be driving home here. We're trying to augment, not replace, tree planting programs. And so we oftentimes find that federal match is very difficult to come by. So this is state funding, which acts as a nice federal match for other existing grants. Next slide, please. So I told you a little bit about the Teddy Grant program. These are existing programs. The Urban and Community Forestry Program, UCF, those are our partners, and I can guarantee they are out planting trees right now. It is March 13th. They are knee deep in planting in communities. So when we talk about tree plantings, we are planting everywhere. We have made some projects where we plant in inner city in Wilmington. So we're really thinking about this from a holistic perspective and looking at tree plantings, not just afforestation, not just reforestation. We're looking at private property. We're looking at, plantings on streets. We're counting everything. What I do want to make you aware of is that the Delaware Forest Service is going to launch their Forest Initiative Fund. That is coming soon. So stay tuned. I think the funding for that might be available in July 1. And reach out to the Delaware Forest Service if you are interested to know more about that. And that is Kyle Hoyt. Another thing is going to be a cost-share program for riparian forest buffers. This is expected to be released during Earth Month. So stay tuned for that. That's through the DENREC Division of Watershed Stewardship. And Marcia Fox is on the line, but that is who your primary contact will be for that. Stay tuned. That is up and coming. We're excited about some of the programs moving forward. Next slide, please. So we know the trees provide many benefits, and they definitely uptake and store carbon. They're essential in achieving climate goals and helping to address climate change everywhere. But moving forward, I know Delaware still has some challenges to overcome. We're working diligently to try to solve the problem of forest conversion. And first of all, we need to have a much better understanding of quantifying that, in hopes to maybe get a statewide legislation sometime. What I can tell you about Delaware is that it is up to the local jurisdictions in Delaware to implement land use law. And so we work with counties to help to work with them. We work with local municipalities in developing tree ordinances. So I can't emphasize enough the importance in Delaware of the local level is really where it's at in making sure that those protections are put in place. So I think that's it. And I think we're saving questions to the end. Is that correct?
We are. Thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you.
And for the sake of time, I will do a very quick ping to Molly. Excited to hear more about what's happening in New York. Keep your questions coming in the chat. We are logging all of them so that we can get through as many as we can during our allotted time. And so without further ado, I will ping it to Molly to hear about how New York State is leveraging their climate planning to advance expansion and restoration of tree canopy. Molly?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Next slide. Okay, there we go. So I'm part of the climate, forestry, and carbon section inside New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation in the Division of Lands and Forests, and I work pretty closely with other programs like our urban and community forests. And the topic's already been introduced, so let's get into it. Next slide. All right, so New York's forests, we have 18.6 million acres of forest land across the state, and overall the state's about 63% forested. I wanted to highlight, though, that about 85% of the population lives in urban areas in the state. So urban forestry is definitely very, very important to the people, whether or not the forests are necessarily inside those urban areas. Next slide. And just a little bit of background, I wanted to talk about how trees take in carbon dioxide from the air through photosynthesis and release oxygen. So that initial uptake is carbon sequestration. And then the carbon is stored inside woods, roots, leaves, until the trees or tree parts decay or are burned. And it can move to other sources, it can move to the soils, it can move to other parts of the ecosystem as well. And when you look at a tree, about half of the dry weight of the wood is carbon that was once removed from the atmosphere by growing the tree. So trees are really important for carbon and climate change mitigation. Next slide. So when you're thinking about climate change mitigation, it's really about the balance of the uptake compared to the release of carbon. So you're really looking at carbon sequestration rather than carbon storage, although you have to also consider what that storage pool is doing if it's emitting carbon. Next slide. So in New York State, our overall land use sequestration trend is driven by forest land, which is that dark green line at the top of that figure. There's also been a slight increase in urban forests, and urban forests make up about 13% of the state's sequestration. And overall, the larger sequestration trend has been driven by a loss of forest area, as well as aging forests. As forests get older, they tend to sequester less carbon, unless you're talking about individual trees, which is a little different. And also forest pests and invasive species have likely played a role in the reduced sequestration. Next slide. So kind of taking a step back here, New York State's Climate Act was established in 2019, and it established a climate action council to develop a scoping plan to meet various targets, including 70% renewable energy by 2030, 100% zero emissions from electricity generation by 2040, and an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas levels from 1990 levels by 2050. And there's also that last point of 100% net zero emissions by 2050, which is very similar to some of the other states that presented here today. And depending on the sequestration from natural working lands, especially for forests, to cancel out the remaining greenhouse gases that are being emitted in the state, which is for our state expected to be about 15%. Next slide. Just highlighting that point. Next slide. All right. So New York State's net zero emissions goal is pretty ambitious. Right now, we have about 28 million metric tons of carbon dioxide sequestration each year. 92% of that is from forests, and about 5% of that is from wood products. And right now, that is offsetting about 7% of New York State's greenhouse gas emissions from other sectors like transportation and buildings. And the net zero goal of 2050 would be about 60 million metric tons of carbon dioxide sequestration we would need. Next slide. So New York State's scoping plan was actually released in December of 2022, so it's pretty new, it's been finalized. Some of the strategies outlined inside that plan include keeping forests as forests, which includes acquisition and avoiding forest conversion to other types of land use. There's also carbon and climate forest management, trying to increase both the resiliency of New York's forests as well as the carbon sequestration and storage inside New York's forests. We have afforestation, reforestation goals. There's one that's been pretty specifically outlined in the plan, including planting on 1.7 million acres or establishing trees on 1.7 million acres, which would be about 680 million million trees, I believe. Across the state, if you're looking at forests, I think it would be fewer acres if you're looking at urban forests. And that would be by 2040. There's also some strategies about preventing and controlling forest pests, diseases, and invasive species, and some strategies focused on urban forestry specifically, as well as workforce and market development. Next slide. So some of the specific urban forestry strategies that have been outlined inside the scoping plan, this is really broadly laid out here, include supporting New York State's urban forestry, urban and community forestry grant programs, providing guidance to local communities and urban foresters on things like adaptation resilience, including flooding, extreme heat, and some of the other climate change impacts we expect to see, as well as forest carbon, outreach tool to try and increase outreach across the state to all of the various stakeholders as well as the public, and potentially establishing urban forest conservation corps. There's also a strategy on doing more research to maximize the efficiency of carbon strategies and the benefits of urban forests. Next slide. So in New York State, the Reforestation Hub has shown that there's potentially 1.25 million acres of urban forest space available. And the Reforestation Hub has defined this as being at least 20% developed would be one of these urban areas. And of that 1.25 million acres of space available, about 53% of that would be street trees and 26% would be residential trees. And that's like a really high level study looking at the potential. But urban forests potentially could contribute to about 4.8 million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year if all of those spaces were able to be utilized. Next slide. And in New York, we already have some existing programs. So focusing specifically on urban programs, we have the urban and community forest grant programs that include tree inventory, community forest management planning, tree planting, and of course, tree maintenance, because you can plant trees, but you have to make sure that they live to hold on to that carbon and not emit them back into the atmosphere. And we also have a program on community forest conservation grants, which it's an acquisition program where forests can be purchased by different municipalities to establish new community forest areas. Next slide. And we also have some additional considerations. Talking about the Climate Act, there's really a highlight for disadvantaged communities and supporting projects in disadvantaged communities. The Climate Justice Working Group through the Climate Act has mapped and targeted areas for implementation. And right now it's a draft consideration. They're hoping to finalize this map by the end of this month, I believe. And certain things like income, race, and ethnicity, health sensitivities, and housing were included in that. So that's really cool. We also need to consider that there may be an expected loss in the future with sequestration due to climate change. Urban trees will probably be especially vulnerable to some of the impacts of climate change, like heat stress, and also considering the resilience of forests. So trying to have a diversity of species, as well as functional traits and genetic diversity across these landscapes. And as climate change goes on, planting will probably become harder because young trees are especially vulnerable to things like drought and heat stress. So we do expect some challenges to come forward. So trees might need extra maintenance and support in the future. Next slide. I wanted to end just highlighting some opportunities. I feel like it's been really great that climate change has kind of called attention to different programs and issues in forestry, especially in urban forestry. And in New York State, we've seen greater collaboration between our various programs and even agencies. And there's also potential funding out there like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Farm Bill. New York State actually passed a bond act last year, which could potentially provide some funding to some programs. And New York State last year also increased the amount inside their Environmental Protection Fund, which is funded through real estate transfer taxes, but can also fund programs like this. And that's all I have, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Lots of great work going on in New York, a lot of opportunity. I mean, all around, all of our panelists, stellar job. Very excited to dive into some of these questions. And so we had quite a few in the chat for everybody. And so one of the ones that has come up in a few different ways for basically everybody has been this subject of mortality, right? So how do you measure tree mortality? How are you planning for tree mortality rates? When you plant a whole bunch more trees, there's going to be inevitable, die-off that happens. How are you all respectively addressing that in your work?
Well, I just wanted to say that maintenance, of course, is extremely important inside all of these different projects. Because, like I said, if you plant trees and they end up dying within 5 years and emitting all that carbon back into the atmosphere, I mean, what was the carbon sequestration goals and what kind of benefits do you actually get?
This is Beth. I think that we all can agree that when you have a reforestation project and you're planting, 40,000 seedlings, you're going to have mortality, and that lot needs to be maintained for invasives, especially. So that's a little bit of a different situation than if you're planting in a park, for example. Not that we have done this yet, but we are discussing bringing in possibly, how can we address this is the question. We're working on that. Partners like University of Delaware, Master Naturals program, what mini army of people can we send out? Because, Delaware is such a small state, we don't have the staff. What volunteers might we be able to utilize? People who have a little bit of expertise. I know we have the Tree Stewards program as another good example. So we're thinking about these things as we move forward. We know with the afforestation and reforestation projects, when you put a lot of trees out, you are going to get mortality. There are some things that can be done when you have trees that are a little more widely spaced, slightly larger trees. Not that we want to see things planted in rows, but check it out. Mount Cuba Center is doing some really interesting research where they're doing experiments on different plots of land, and rows might be the way to go, because then you can go in there years 1 through 5 with a mower and kick back some of those invasive species. And then I think, if I remember correctly, they went through in subsequent years with understory and planted understory. And the plots are beautiful. So if you ever get a chance to either go there or hear more about their research, they're doing some great stuff up there.
I was just going to add, in addition to those points of emphasis on how to support maintenance and management to reduce, unexpected mortality, there's also the obligation that we have to be able to track and account for that transparently, not only in like what it means to hit 5 million trees, but then also in terms of its carbon benefit. So I think that's one of the benefits of integrating our inventory and this tree tracker tool understanding is it's going to help, if we're getting the field data, we're losses, we're accounting for them, and also drive, increased investments for replacement fees or, continue to expand opportunities. So I can dig into those details with anyone who's interested, but that's something we're really looking to make sure we don't lose track of.
I can jump in real quick here too. On the carbon side, for planting projects, we issue credits based on the forecasted carbon storage at year 26. We impose a default 20% mortality deduction up front. So that's taken off the forecasted carbon storage. And then, of course, we require that sampling at those intervals. And if your sampling it shows that your trees are not growing or not alive on track with the forecasted carbon storage, the issuances at those intervals are reduced. So we build mortality into the way we issue the credits on the planting side. Preservation side, those are so-called avoided conversion projects. So the credits are issued when the biomass, the carbon, is protected. The projects have to commit to keeping that biomass in place, though. So if there's significant die-off, then there has to be a compensation for that. So the preservation projects are essentially required to track and monitor. Well, I mean, both planning and preservation have to monitor and track and report on that. On the preservation side, if you have a catastrophic like act of God loss, that is covered by an insurance pool of credits that we maintain at the registry, at the carbon registry level, city forest credits. If the tree loss is because you've abandoned the project or you're not taking care of the trees and you're grossly negligent, then you have to cover that tree loss. In other words, you have to return credits or compensate for credits you've already received. So mortality is built right into the carbon. That's why I say the carbon projects are high quality, because the projects are really accountable for the survival of the trees. I should say, projects are accountable for not getting credits beyond the carbon that is actually stored in the trees.
Thank you for that. Really great takes on how to deal with mortality, which is an inevitable but an unfortunate kind of part of the work. One more question.
We're having some difficulty in the accounting aspect, and it's because of the great variability. I mean, some of these projects, you're going to want to take those trees out on purpose. You plant a ton of trees in there, and when it comes to thinning and really having a really good forest, tree, you're going to get spindly, tall trees that aren't going to be what you're looking for in terms of health. So that really makes also the accounting and the carbon reduction numbers even that much more difficult when there's just that much variability from tree to tree and from project to project. We're looking forward to attending the National Learning Lab through the U.S. Climate Alliance to hope to get some answers on that as we move forward. But
yeah, great points. I did want to see if we could just get one kind of quick tip from each of you as well. We had a lot of enthusiasm around tracking, right? Several of your states have some tracking tools that are available for the public. Obviously, Mark, with your work, there's some independent verification and tracking going on to bolster the case for investment in carbon credits. Curious about if you were to give folks on the line one tip for either convening like-minded stakeholders, say we need a tracking tool, let's create a tracking tool, let's fundraise for a tracking tool, or let's partner with an entity that's going to help us track better. What from your learning processes, from your tracking work, what's the one tip that you would give to the audience here on making the most of their tracking? So maybe we can go backwards. We can start with Mark and go back.
Well, this is a really interesting topic, and to me, it goes right to the heart of urban forestry as a field, which is one of our great strengths. Is it's been sort of decentralized, so that you have local people who know their communities, know their trees, know their climates, delivering the urban forest services. The downside to that is, there are a lot of costs when everyone is doing their own work with different platforms, different inventory systems. And there could be some real efficiencies if somehow this were put together at a larger scale. So right now, we're a standard setting body, the registry. So we don't make people have to follow a particular inventory product. The two main ones you would think of would be Planet Geo's and then the iTree inventory system. A lot of people use those. Some organizations have their own. We defer to the local choice in that regard. So we don't make them have to use a particular inventory system or inventory product. However, when I hear about Rachel talking about the Maryland system, and that's just music to my ears. I mean, it'd be wonderful if every state or even the country, that's maybe dreaming too big right now, but had a sort of organized inventory system for all the trees, and all the data could be kept. With data science getting to be where it is, that becomes possible now. So I think that would be a huge efficiency gain for urban forestry if we could somehow, in a way, keep the local people involved in that, because they're going to be inputting a lot of that data, but somehow have that be aggregated and maintained in a larger system that's got visibility for all kinds of people. I think it's a part of our accountability. The reforestation groups, that reforestation effort has come under a lot of criticism for not tracking those trees. This is the $1 a tree model, for one tree planted, and those that's had a lot of criticism for not tracking survival and not being accountable for their trees. We don't want that to happen in urban forestry. Ideally, we want our trees to be planted, not feast or famine, but planted and have a systems approach to accounting for those trees over time.
Great. Other thoughts on advice to folks about data tracking, making the most of their systems?
Well, if you're in Maryland, talk to me, because one of to be honest, one of the things we're trying to do is trying to increasingly invest in a state system that can be made relevant and useful to other types of users, which again, there's always trade-offs across scale. So if I'm the state and I'm trying to measure what's happening at the state scale, I might be using different resolution of data inputs or accounting for things in a way that may be helpful for you in some of your goals, but maybe you want to even drive to, higher resolution, or you might look at things a slightly different way based on your own needs. But the more that, we can leverage the investments we're making at scale to really drive down and meet needs that you have, I agree. It would help instead of, we're imagining, for example, every single county or city having to develop its own brand new inventory, often if it's using the same source data. Second thing I was going to say is, I think we've learned here at the state scale, you have to be open to versioning, right? Like things improve, your understanding of things improve over time. And that can be hard because we have a specific number, we got to stick with that number, then the data or the science improves and we feel less nimble to be able to take advantage of that. So doing the best you can with the access to the data and tools you have, get that first estimate out there of whatever it is you're tracking, and then remain postured to understanding versioning and improvements over time. I think that's important for transparently communicating what's happening and why that matters. And then the third thing, be very clear about what it is you're tracking. So if it's carbon, that's going to require different kinds of data often than if you're just tracking tree canopy cover fractions, or if you're tracking other real important social benefits. It's intuitive at one level, but it's okay if you need to be very clear about what you're tracking, and that you might need an assortment of different data to really get the picture that you need.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that partnering is probably the most important for us. And I think that we probably have between 2 and 3 meetings a week with partner organizations talking about what are you doing. Communication is key. We are all on the same team. Most of us, we're trying to accomplish very similar goals. Maybe the reason for planting the trees might be slightly different for water quality purposes, but regardless, it's the same benefit and the same outcome. So we might as well put our heads together and figure out a plan together so that we're not duplicating efforts. And this is one of the #1 problems, especially in a small state, You do not want to be duplicating efforts, and you want to work together with all of your partner organizations.
Excellent. Any final thoughts from you, Molly? Or
Yeah, so because our scoping plan was just finalized so recently, we haven't really delved into how we're going to track tree planting or much other than the greenhouse gas inventory at this point. But it's been really helpful to hear about all of your other different tracking tools, everyone. I appreciate it.
awesome. Well, Molly speaks for all of us on the line where who are excited to hear about this. And thank you all again to our presenters. I will turn it over to Brandy, who's going to tee us up for our discussion time together, where we can keep the conversation going and talk in a more robust way, peer-to-peer, about leveraging some of these data and technical needs, figuring out how to leverage state and federal funding, as well as the tree policy resilience. So to continue the conversation. So we are about to break for lunch. Let me not stand in between you and your nutritious meal that is awaiting you. Essentially, if you would like to eat lunch with others, there are some optional networking breakout rooms that'll be available to do that. During each lunch hour, both today and tomorrow, we'll have a tool to explore. And today's tool is the Climate and Health Action Guide, which you can see on your screen right now. It's on Vibrant Cities Lab, the Vibrant Cities Lab website, which Julie has graciously already put in the chat. And so check that tool out. We look forward to seeing you all back at 12:40, or yes. So we should see you all at 12:40. We'll get going with our afternoon event then. And basically we have some more goodies in store for you all. So looking forward to reconvening with you all after lunch. I'm sure everybody has a moment to kind of get situated. Have your afternoon coffee, tea, water, mason jar of water in my case. All right. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get back in to the swing of things. We've got a brief poll to actually get us back on board, back on the horse. And I'm going to be asking how well you know your trees. So if you can, take a moment to take our brief poll. The first question is, how tall is the largest known living tree by volume? This is quite the question. Hopefully we'll all get it right. I'm guessing as much as anybody else is on the line. So if you haven't already been able to tell, I am actually not a tree expert. I'm a communications expert. So this is, I just talk for a living and write for a living. So it's just about tree things, but yes. All right, and hopefully everybody who's still joining us can take a moment to take that poll. We're looking forward to getting the results back from that poll shortly. Are we ready to reveal results?
People are still answering.
People are still answering. Okay, we'll give it another minute or two. I know folks are all coming back in.
All right, it's slowing down, so I'll wrap it up here for you, Sarah.
All right. Okay. All right. So mixed results here. The actual answer is General Sherman, which is a giant sequoia. That's a great name for a tree. General Sherman. It's fantastic. It's the largest tree by volume in the world, and it stands at 275 feet tall. So the 5% of you that answered that answer, you got it right. It has 52,000 cubic feet of wood. Wow. Imagine the carbon. Anyway, we all appreciate this. Anyway, I was like, whoa, that's, where my mind first went. By volume, it's the largest known living single stem tree on Earth. And it's in California. Look at that. We've got it stateside. So that's fantastic. If you guess 380 feet, that is the tallest living tree, which is called Hyperion. It's a coastal redwood, which is also in California. And so, wow. Yeah. So tallest tree by volume is General Sherman, a giant sequoia. Tallest living tree period is a redwood out in California. So thank you for your participation in that fun poll. We are excited to kick off the second half of day one of our Chesapeake Bay Tree Canopy Funding and Policy Roundtable. And so we are going to dive right in to getting into our next panel. So I'll pause mute my as there's activity always in urban areas. Okay, I think that they've passed. Okay, fantastic. So we've discussed our first, core theme around climate this morning. We're now going to be moving into tree loss, specifically the kinds of policy tools that we have at our disposal to minimize tree loss or require mitigation of tree loss through fines and fees. So you'll hear in this upcoming panel some examples of policies at different scales of government, state government, county government, municipal government, that are having an impact. And so we're really excited to hear from these afternoon speakers. We've got Karen Firehock out of the Green Infrastructure Center, who's going to be talking about some Bay-wide loss trends and some local policy solutions. We've got Marian Honeczy out of the Maryland DNR Forest Service, who will be talking a little bit more about the Maryland Conservation Act, the Forest Conservation Act, as a policy model to stem tree loss. Vincent Verweij out of Arlington County, who is going to be talking a little bit more about the county's tree loss policies. And we also will be hearing from Katie Lauter, who is out of Baltimore Green Space. She's very active in the chat, talking about, and she's going to be telling us about how she's working to revise city ordinances in Baltimore to promote forest patch conservation. And so with that, I will turn it over to Karen.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I am going to go relatively quickly, but just as a reminder, all of these slides will be made available to you after the conclusion of this conference. So don't worry about trying to copy down links or trying to make note of everything I'm going to mention today. So I'm going to talk about adopting the best policies and codes for a healthy urban forest. Next. So I run the nonprofit Green Infrastructure Center, and we founded the company about 16 years ago to help communities evaluate their green assets and manage them to maximize ecology, economy, and culture. So green infrastructure can help with all of that. And if you haven't already guessed, trees are green infrastructure. So we do this work by mapping land cover and urban tree canopy. We do a lot of modeling of the ecosystem benefits that forests provide. We also map high-value wildland habitats, and we create strategic green infrastructure plans, so strategies for protecting your green infrastructure now and into the future. And we test these ideas on the ground. So what we mostly specialize in is turning our lessons learned into tools and technical support. So that's why we're a not-for-profit. Next. So we have a number of tools. I'm not going to go through all these today, but just to let you know, there's a lot of publications that we have available, most of which are completely free. So if you're interested in learning more about some of the topics I'll cover today, just go to our website, gicinc.org, especially if you're interested in storm planning or resiliency. Next. So one thing I want to highlight today is a guide that we recently completed this past fall, looking at how to have an effective tree campaign. And this is written both for community activist groups as well as for local government staff. So whether you're trying to make the case to your own mayor for planting more trees or get your public works department on board, goes through all the arguments that we have made and heard over the years. That also gets into the nitty gritty, everything from watering and long-term care to how to use this information to change policy. All right, next. So we created a free workbook also to talk about policies and codes that you need to have in place. Now, this particular guide was written for South Carolina because they frankly asked us to do this work. It was funded by the U.S. Forest Service. So some of the examples I'll talk about today are derived from this guide, which is also free to download. But I'm going to bring in some examples also from the Chesapeake Bay region for today's conference. Next. So we do need to be concerned. We've already talked a little bit about tree loss in the Chesapeake Bay region, but if we even just think about the entire country, canopy cover is trending downwards at about 175,000 acres lost every year, or about 36 million trees annually. And as these trees are lost, of course, so are the benefits. But NOAA and Greenfield have gone to undertaken the difficult task of quantifying this as an economic loss of about $96 million per year. So as we try to make the case for protecting canopy, we really need to focus on the economic benefits that trees provide. Next. So how are we doing in the Chesapeake Bay region? You saw this slide earlier today. And as you look at those numbers, especially number 2, where we're looking at loss by state, just be aware, of course, that those numbers are based on the percent of Chesapeake Bay drainage. So for example, New York has probably lost some trees, but in the Chesapeake Bay drainage, they've gained 78 acres. Virginia is a much larger state than Maryland. So although we've lost less trees, percent-wise, it might be a different picture. So take those with a grain of salt, but it's really helpful to have this statistic because a lot of times we get asked, well, how is our state doing? And in some of my work with the Virginia legislature, that's a question that comes off often. Are we really needing to plant more trees? Do we really need to do this? Because it seems like there's lots of trees, but it depends on where you're looking. It depends on the perspective that you have. So next slide, please. So do go and get a copy of your status and change report. These reports are available for all of the counties in the Chesapeake Bay drainage. And I'm actually looking forward to getting mine for my county and taking it to our county elected officials as we update our comprehensive plan. Next slide. So good codes are essential, and you can go ahead and click through to get to the last bullet. So we often focus more on tree planting than on tree saving. So on the one hand, we're planting 400 trees over here, and on the other hand, we're not taking good care of our older trees, or we're losing them just to old age. I grew up in a leafy green neighborhood in Northwest DC, and we lost a lot of those trees in the last several decades just because of age and also from storms. We often overlook the long-term needs for our trees. So, we plant them, we get excited, and then after a couple of years, we forget about them. And of course, not anyone on this call, but just in general, I'm thinking about society in general. And then there's a lot of interest in million tree campaigns, but sometimes they fail if you look at them over the long term. And why is that? Because sometimes they're putting trees back in that same tree well that was too small to begin with. So that tree failed for a reason. And if we don't address the systemic reason why that tree failed and just put one back there, we'll lose it all over again. So planting campaigns are still a great idea when done right. Next. A lot of communities ask us, what should we have in place? We created actually a questionnaire online for communities to fill out, to sort of a self-assessment tool. And we look at different things. So we grouped them into categories. So if you're seeds, your city's just starting out. Roots, you're just getting going. You meet the requirements of Tree City USA. A sapling, you're starting to grow the program. And a tree is sort of our ideal version of what you should have in place. Next. So we have a little table here. And so if you look at it, you can see the top column, seeds, roots, saplings, and trees. And we just go through the different elements that every successful program should have in place. And I also want to point out Engagement with the community and funding are also essential elements that you should have in place, even if your program is just getting going. So you might take a look at that list later in our guide and think about whether there's any things in your community that you could be adding. Next. So one of the things that we really want to focus on in today's presentation is to think about the codes and policies that you should have in place. And I am not going to give you an 8-hour lecture today. I'm not allowed, but I want to point out that there are a lot of codes that I'm not going to cover. But we have a little spreadsheet tool, and what it does is it asks you, do you have policies in place that are driving too much impervious surface? So for example, if you are planting trees on one part of the city, but your excessive parking requirements are driving tree loss in another part of the city, you didn't necessarily win. So we need to look at these policies and codes and whether they're facilitating trees being in the ground. So in short, are you allowing too much impervious area and runoff? And can you manage and expand your urban forestry program to soak up even more stormwater? Next. So this is the code audit tool, and this is how it works. You get points from 1 to 3, depending on whether that code is essential to it would be nice if you had it. And you go ahead and fill it out. Next slide. Next. And you get a little table that tells you how you're doing and which areas you may need to improve. And we're constantly updating this tool to when we learn about new codes or new ideas that cities should have in place. But you can kind of perform that audit on yourselves, or if you don't have a lot of time, do what I do, hire a grad student to help you do it. Next. All right, so let's begin with the very beginning. Does your community have a robust tree ordinance? So there's a lot of different elements that are important for a robust tree ordinance to be in place. And so I'm going to go through some of those, but if you are interested in learning more about what should go in the ordinance, we have some sample ordinances developed. Next slide. All right, so let's think about all of the things that you might want to have in place. And where should they be found? So your comprehensive plan should talk about trees, your subdivision ordinances, your parking lot standards, your landscape buffers, the street trees, types of utility placement, conflicts, tree well design, all of that. Park and open space planning. So a lot of open spaces plans don't necessarily mention trees. They sort of think of them as an afterthought. Regulations governing tree protection during development. So is that robust? Standards for tree canopy by different zoning classes. Regulations for local authority buildings. So always looking at ourselves and saying, do we have good standards for our government facilities? And then entrance corridor regulations, which have to do with the beautification of your entry corridor, but trees are an integral part of that. So do they talk about that? Next. All right, so trees and forests and policy. So the comprehensive plan sets the direction for future growth and policy of a community that's updated every 5 years. When you enact new zoning, it should be in accordance with the comprehensive plan. So does your comprehensive plan mention trees? And in what way does it mention them? Does it just say, we like trees, they're nice? Does it talk about tree canopy cover? Does it actually set strategies in place? So that's a sort of fun weekend activity for all of you, or during the week, is to go and open that comp plan and see what it actually says. And are there master plans in your community? Do they mention or show tree location? I rarely see master plans that get into the detail of the trees, but they really should. Next. So sometimes when we do ordinances, we have a great intention, but then it doesn't quite turn out as we hoped. So here's an example of big tree saving gone wrong. This is for a community that required saving all trees that were at least 20 inches DBH, diameter at breast height. But they didn't prevent filling in the wetland that the trees are growing in. And so what's happened here is you can see that there's a lot of root flare on the bottom of that tree. It was growing in a wet environment. And they then filled in the wetland and raised the elevation of the land. But this tree's canopy extends far out over the parking lot. And actually what's happened is there's a number of tree wells like this throughout the development. And so rather than actually saving these trees, which will not survive, I've asked multiple arborists to look at this tree, and they've all given it a 6-year death sentence. That's because its roots are now deep under the parking lot for the large part. And this actually made the development spread out to be much larger because there's all these holes punched in the parking lot to save trees that won't be saved. It would have been better to make a more compact parking lot, lose some of these trees, and have a much bigger and more robust forest buffer on the outside that wasn't filled. Next slide. All right, so let's think about adaptive systems that allow our trees to get big. We see this all the time where people plant a large canopy shade tree in a tiny space. So I know a lot of people don't have this in their standards, but the sort of idealized amount of soil volume area for a large canopy tree is 1,000 cubic feet of soil. That's a lot of soil. And there are some other tricks you can use to put trees in tight spaces, which I'll show in just a moment. But here's an example of an adaptive system. And this is better than those metal tree grates, some of which are very difficult to remove and the tree grows into them. These are little permeable pavers. And so it provides a nice safe spot for you to park your car and you can walk across them. But as that tree grows, it's super easy to lift those out and allow that tree to get bigger. Next slide. So there are other ways to help large trees grow in tiny spaces. So thinking about structural cells that can be underground and they can actually help direct the roots to where you want them to be. And then they can use permeable and suspended pavements over top. So I put this little zoom in of an actual permeable pavement. I'm always taking my water bottle when I visit cities and pouring it on the ground to see if the pavement's permeable. But in this case, yes, these are permeable bricks and they're designed to let some air as well as water get to those roots much better. So we can have these large trees in small spaces. Next. Click. Okay, so these trees were planted at the same time, and thanks to Green Blue Urban for letting me borrow these. This is a company that makes a lot of these structural supports. And so these trees were planted at the same time. If you look on the left, you can see that some of the sort of wisps of dead branches. And then if you look on the right, there are really healthy trees. But on the left, they have more open space for planting. So what's the difference? Well, if you click, we'll show you the underground supports that are helping the trees on the right get bigger. Next. All right, so that's what's really going on underneath. So in places where you don't have a lot of room and you're going to have a lot of foot traffic, you consider these. They also allow to use these cells as stormwater storage devices and can also help you keep roots away from your utilities. Next. So we can just keep going in the interest of time, but they can be fitted into a lot of tight urban spaces. Next. All right, so tree removal permits. So I'm going to go through some of these examples of codes that you should have in place. So require permits to remove trees, yes, even on private property. It's really important a certified arborist review the request. Some cities just have an administrative assistant who doesn't know anything about the trees. So we need somebody who has the skills to know if this is a bona fide request and actually being able to visit the site and meet with the homeowner, because sometimes you can let them know things such as that tree is actually improving the value of your property. That tree is soaking up thousands of gallons of stormwater per year, preventing your basement from flooding. So having that personal touch and that expert on hand is really important. Next. All right, so there's a number of good ordinances out there. If you don't have good ordinances in your community, you could just copy from others that do. So Fox Chapel, Pennsylvania, any trees larger than 6 inches DBH, even if it's healthy or diseased, require you to obtain a permit. Annapolis, Maryland has great requirements for tree conservation areas in the front, side, or rear yard setbacks. And of course, takes care of trees that are greater than 5 inches DBH. All right, Washington, D.C., my home state, colony, sometimes I say. My city requires private property trees between 44 and 99.9 inches in circumference as special trees. So you heard about that already this morning. But it's a really great tool. And I really applaud DC for taking care of those large, spectacular trees. Next. All right. One of the challenges, though, is that sometimes people remove trees because they know that the fine that they have to pay is pretty small. And in Virginia, we have a challenge because our civil fines are capped at a few $1,000s. So we don't have a lot of options. But one thing that you can do is to do things such as, if you can't make it enough of a financial incentive, you can do things such as looking at requiring the DBH to be replaced. So for example, one locality said trees removed unlawfully, the board can require up to 10 times the total DBH of the trees removed. And we did that here in Charlottesville, where a developer removed a very large, several hundred-year-old beech tree. We made him replace the basal area of the tree removed. So we had to plant many beech trees back for the one that was lost. Next. All right, and then right tree, right place is super important. You can see this V-shaped tree that was pruned by the utility to try to protect the lines. Power is really important to all of us. So let's not plant those large canopy trees under power lines. There are a whole suite of programs for demonstration plantings of small shrubs and trees under power lines, but making sure we have the right tree in the right place, because when we de-prune those trees, we make them unstable and prone to failure. Next. All right, so an example here's from Rock Hill, South Carolina. It shall be the duty of any person planting or growing a public tree to place it so as not to be a traffic hazard or interfere with the overhead or underground public utilities. Prune trees so as not to cause a hazard, and so the minimum clearance of any overhang portion is 8 feet above any sidewalk and 14 feet above any street. And then have a nice pre-approved list of what can be planted where. Next. All right, then working with developers to shrink the development footprint. Don't permit lot line to lot line clearing. So don't allow the clearing of the land before they come in for a site plan. Look for opportunities to minimize impervious surfaces. So try to meet with developers before they've spent money on their plan and they've got a lot of money invested in a particular design, so that you can have that conversation, and especially for large scale developments. Some communities even require their arborists to sit in on and review tree plans for large developments. Next. Consider a cluster ordinance. Go ahead and click. This is an animation. So in some cases, we will just build out every area of the lot. In this example, I left a little sort of, commons treed area in the middle, but we could do better than that. Next. By having clustering, we can actually shrink those lot sizes and protect a large swath of intact forest and provide nature trails and other amenities that urbanites are clamoring for. Next. Protect trees before development. This is super important. So consider a waiting period between when land is cleared for forestry and when it's allowed to be developed. Discuss site alterations. Consider whether you can work with the developer to go taller instead of wider, a 3-story instead of a 2-story building, a 2-story instead of a 1-story. If you allow that land clearing to occur before you have the conversation, there's no conversation left to be had because the trees are gone. So making sure that there's a waiting period. Next. All right, so some localities have adopted ordinances saying that you actually have to have a waiting period of up to 3 years, and that you have to survey those trees and look at all of the different building construction activities and plan that in accordance with tree protection. It's also important to make sure that a certified professional is in charge of looking at the trees themselves. Next.
And Karen, just so on time, you have just about 4 minutes left or so.
Okay, great. So canopy cover requirements. Consider having a minimum tree canopy coverage requirement by zoning class, and encourage saving large trees. Give more credit for tree retention. So one community only gave credit for new trees, and unfortunately developers cut down the trees and planted new ones to get the credit. So that was another intention of a good intention gone wrong. Next. Next. Okay, so here's some examples of ordinances that you can think about. Fairfax County has a good one you can see there, as well as Montgomery County, Maryland. And they have a very specific table that talks about this, how many trees you have to have based on how much land you've disturbed. Virginia's challenging because we have a cap on the amount of canopy percent that can be required. 10% for commercial, 15% for planned unit development, 20% for most residential, and 30% for low density residential. Other states don't have that challenge. But as you've seen in this presentation, there's lots of different ways that you can protect trees. Next. All right, consider a stream buffer ordinance. I know that all the Chesapeake Bay states in the areas that are covered by Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act have to have stream buffers, but as you probably know, there's a lot of counties and cities that are outside of that area that are still within the Chesapeake Bay drainage basin. So consider adopting a buffer ordinance for your locality. Next. All right, click through this. So thinking about parking lot standards, do you have a parking maximum or a cap on parking? A lot of communities have parking minimums. Do you allow variable space sizing of your parking spaces? You can fit a lot more cars in there and trees if you are more creative with how you arrange your parking. Next. All right, tree species list. And I know I'm just about out of time, so some communities don't even have a list. Some of them have improper species on their list, such as red maples for street trees or Bradford pears. I'm still seeing those. So think about a code that requires species diversity and not just the same species of trees over and over. Next. All right, protect trees during development. Next. We'll just click on through. So thinking about fencing, protecting the root zone, maybe even going out past the drip line where the roots actually go. Next. Protecting trees after installation, consider bonding your trees just like you do your stormwater management. I see a lot of trees dying in developments 1 or 2 years later because they're planted improperly, but the locality has no recourse because they had no bond on those. Next. We're going to click on all the way through. Complete green streets. A lot of people have complete streets, but they don't include the green part. So think about whether you're also including using bioswales with trees as part of stormwater management. Next. All right, thinking about including your trees as part of stormwater infrastructure. So for example, Harrisonburg gives reductions in the stormwater fee that people have to pay to property owners who plant trees. Next. All right, and then click through those. A lot of localities actually use trees as a BMP, including, again, Washington, D.C. Yay, D.C. Okay, keep going. We're just about done. And then the Chesapeake Bay program, of course, also gives credits for planting trees, whether it's urban canopy expansion, urban forest planting, or planting a buffer. There's a simple little equation you can use. Next. All right, so remember the free tools we featured today and get them. Learn your tree cover. See if you've got the right codes in place that are working for your trees. See what you get on a tree audit score and launch a planting campaign. That takes us to the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karen. Thank you all for participating in the chat, keeping the questions coming in. Looking forward to getting to those at the close of the panel. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marian from Maryland to talk more about what work they're doing statewide.
Okay, so I'm Marian Honeczy. I'm the Associate Director for the Maryland Forest Service. I'm here to talk about one of our programs and to let you know, I actually was hired to do the implementation and enforcement when this law started. So yeah, I've been around a long time in the Maryland Forest Service urban program. So I'm here to talk about the Maryland's Forest Conservation Act, and I'm going to shut off my video. I'm here to talk about the Forest Conservation Act. This was created through a report of the Governor's Task Force on Trees and Forests in Maryland. In 1990, this task force was composed of all sorts of people, all sorts of groups in Maryland, from counties, towns, state agencies, commercial builders, home builders, the ag community, the forest community, everybody and anyone that's involved in anything in Maryland. And if you're not aware, and I should have said this up front, Maryland is a highly regulated state. So the governor, who then at the time was former Governor Schaefer, set up this task force, and recommendation number 7 out of, I think, 30 was basically to create a Forest Conservation Act. The act was written and adopted in 1991. It created the need for regulations, which were adopted in 1992. And as a first for Maryland legislation, it included a model ordinance to assist local governments with drafting their own ordinance. So basically, the model ordinance takes the statute and regulations and rewrites them in a way so local governments can copy and paste into their own ordinances if they so choose. It also required a technical manual to be written, which is more of a hands-on, here's how you do it, but it's not a legally enforced manual. Next. Okay. So basically, FCA requires that all local governments with planning and zoning authority to adopt an ordinance effective January 1st, 1993. Now, I want to preface this and let you know, Maryland is a little different from some other states. We do not have true home rule. I'm from New Jersey. So basically, in New Jersey, every square inch is covered by an incorporated town, and the counties kind of look at the overall bigger picture. In Maryland, not every square inch is covered by a town. We have some counties that don't have any incorporated towns within them. I think we have 161 incorporated towns in Maryland, 581 census designated places, and 24 counties and Baltimore City. So it's a little different here. So we have some counties that implement all the planning and zoning, like Baltimore County. The county does it for the entire area. There is no incorporated cities. FCA is administered by the Maryland Forest Service. It's implemented at both the state and local level. The Forest Service, though, is responsible for the implementation through oversight, and we handle the direct review of projects on state and federal land that are state and federally funded. The prime objective of the law is to minimize the loss of forest land from development and ensure that priority areas for forest retention and planting are identified and protected prior to development. So again, the law was only envisioned to minimize the loss of forest land, and we are conserving forests that are protected prior to development. The applicability requires that any person, federal, state, local government, or private entity that's applying for any permits or plan approvals in the state on areas 40,000 square feet or greater must comply. Now, this is basically anybody doing any work to change the land use on a piece of land 40,000 square feet or greater. Area does not mean forested area. Former Governor Schaefer felt that areas that were non-forested and areas that are forested should both have to comply with this law. Next. Okay, there are some exceptions to the law, which includes timber harvest, agriculture, because there's really no change of land use occurring. Those exceptions, though, have to sign a form that basically says for the next 5 years, they will not change land use. If they do change the land use on the property is looked at as it was before the activity occurred. We also have exemptions for FAA regulated areas, critical area law, a number of others, as I said, 15. Forest Conservation Act has two components to it, a forest stand delineation, which basically takes a construction plan and gives it a three-dimensional look to it. So besides the items you normally see on construction plans, it also includes a forest inventory. So you see ground plane, overstory, understory of what's going on. The second component is a forest conservation plan, which those of you who are familiar to 7 erosion control plans, it looks very similar, but what it shows is how the forest isn't being impacted and what areas are going to be protected. So it shows the limits of disturbance. There is a worksheet that determines mitigation. There is a planting plan, and we require native trees, and we have a stocking size based on the size of the material you're planting. So we tell you numbers if it's seedlings, numbers if it is 1-inch caliber. There is a specimen tree variance or waiver request, and that is if you are removing a tree that's 75% of the specimen tree in the state. We require a 2-year maintenance plan. We require bonding, a conservation easement on anything that's protected, and whether you're protecting existing forest or planted area. And if you can't do any protection or planting on-site or off-site, you must pay fee in lieu. And fee in lieu then requires the reviewing authority, the county or town that accepted the fee in lieu, or the state. We are now responsible to do your mitigation planting. And FCA does contain preferred sequences for afforestation, reforestation, priorities for afforestation, reforestation, and priority areas for retention and protection. Next. So the law does prioritize on-site retention and planting. It enables street tree planting and off-site retention of existing forests. So what we also allow is basically what's happening with some of the counties. So, you know, regarding back to like the timber harvesting, we do have the declaration of intents, but if you're a developer and you want to do a pre-development harvest, so while you're waiting to actually start construction, you already are in the process or received your permits for the project, you are allowed to go in these counties and do the harvest within the areas of your plan that you are already proposing to remove the trees anyway for your development. So instead of there being a lot of chipping or burning on site, we have harvesting occurring and the trees going to a mill or elsewhere. We do collect fee in lieu, and it must be planted in the county and the watershed. So basically, so you know, changes over time, and I've been here since 1993 doing this work. One of the first changes is that there was a new exemption put in that exempted out paved areas. So if you're a developer looking to redesign or rebuild the mall, you don't need to comply with FCA because the mall is already on paved area. There's no new ground disturbance, so you would be exempt. And this has encouraged redevelopment and work in brownfields. We have the Public Service Commission in Maryland has been requiring solar panel projects that need to get their CPCN to comply with afforestation. So we are getting trees planted, and now federal bases are complying with FCA through an MOU with their JAG office. And again, we have the FAA exemption for trees that have been determined to be a hazard. Next. So what we've seen over time, and this is the 25-year report, and yes, I know I'm off by 5 years, but one of the changes that was made to the act is it allows a local government 6 months to turn in their annual report based on the previous fiscal year. So we are now collecting the annual reports from fiscal year 22, and we'll be creating the 30-year report. So for basically in the first 25 years of the law, we know that 315,000 acres of existing forests went through planning and zoning through permit review process, that 189,803 or 60% of that existing forest was retained on site. We know that 114,000 acres was cleared, which is roughly 36%, and that 33,000 acres of forest were planted across the state. Now, the interesting thing that I have found interesting, we've done this report every 5th year. So the 5, 10, 15, 20, and now the 25-year report have consistently shown that 60% of the forest on site have been retained. Now, you're going to say to me that the numbers don't add up. It's not 100% because you should have retained and cleared should equal existing. Well, what we're finding and have found from the 5th year report that your permit only allows you to clear X number of acres on the site, because that's what the permit is for. The easement covers that which is required for protection. So then you have this gray area of forest on site that isn't protected but can't be cleared. So it's kind of this gray zone. And we actually are finding we are protecting or saving more forests than you would think through also this gray zone. Next. So I was asked to talk about or add on to my presentation the bonuses from the Forest Conservation Act. And these are things we didn't expect. We should have, but we didn't. Basically, we're getting a forest inventory of the land, the species, size, class, and health by lot and parcel of every piece of lot and parcel that is going through land development, going through land use change. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's still there now, but we know what was there and how healthy it was. We have data, actual data to be used on land use change. So we know how much forest was on site, how much cleared, how much protected, and how much planted. So we have actual numbers. We're not estimating. We have large tracts of existing forests protected by easements through mitigation banking. So basically, we have existing forest and planted forests that are protected through mitigation banking. We've created an industry. We have an industry of qualified professionals. These are people who are able to do this work. We have a new category of environmental professionals in the state that are doing this work. We also have mitigation banking bankers and brokers. We've created a small cottage industry of people who are either selling the easements, being landowners, or the brokers that are helping work the deals. We have planted an existing forest mitigation areas throughout the state, whether they're in urban areas, suburban areas, or rural areas, protected by easements that allow forest management to occur in them. We have consultants that are reporting the protected specimen trees to the Maryland Big Tree Program. This one fascinates me because as the consultants, the qualified professionals, are doing their FSDs and FCPs, they are locating the specimen trees because now they have to get variances. They're locating them on the plans. And if they're in the areas, you can, the protected areas, they're reporting them to the Maryland Big Tree Program. And the last is this law allows us to establish a connection with the local jurisdictions that enable discussions on future other forestry products. Next. And there's my contact info. If you need to talk to me on any aspect, please let me know. I'm more than willing to talk to anybody on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Marian. Awesome work. It's rare that folks are in the space and get to see it from the beginning and get to then have all of these great data points to be able to demonstrate success. So fantastic work there. I'm going to turn it over to Vincent Verweij, who is out of Arlington County. Vince, you're up.
Thank you. I don't know if my video is showing, but it's not that important. I'm Vincent Verweij. I'm the Urban Forest Manager for Arlington County. And go ahead and go next. We manage about 750,000 trees through planting, planning, and maintenance. Our tree maintenance is paid for through our general fund, which is a tree crew and a tree maintenance contract. Our tree planting is paid by the stormwater fund, which is funded through our stormwater utility, tree replacement payments and fines. And the stormwater fund is going through an update. Their stormwater utility is likely to be tied to impervious cover of each individual property. So the more impervious cover you have, the higher your stormwater utility will be, which will help pay for tree replacement, but also encourage reduction of impervious area. And then tree planting on private property is funded by the Tree Canopy Fund, which is funded by special exception development projects, like site plans, they're called in Arlington County. And particularly on those site plans where replacement plants cannot find a space on site. Every tree that cannot find a space on site, we do prefer them to replant on site, but sometimes they can't. Needs to be donated at $2,400 per tree replacement. into the Tree Canopy Fund. This is administered by Eco Action Arlington, who are our nonprofit partner, and we work closely with them to review the tree planting applications. Next. So all our public trees, so trees in the right of way and parks and other public spaces are protected by Chapter 67 of the Arlington County Code. We are kind of unusual in that we own most of our streets in Arlington County. That's unusual in Virginia. So we do also own most of the trees in our right of way. People can request removal of these trees. We either do that through our tree maintenance, or if there's a request for removal of a healthy tree, we review that. We can deny that, or if it's for a development that's permitted by the zoning ordinance, we can require replacement to the stormwater fund or the tree canopy fund, depending on where the tree is. Unpermitted removal gets an assessment done by an urban forester, and we use the landscape appraised value from the Council of Tree and Landscape Appraisal Guide. The value gets paid into the stormwater fund as well. And this enforcement of unpermitted removal can sometimes be tricky because you can, for example, have a truck hit a tree and you don't know who did it, and you kind of have to just suck it up, even though the tree has been damaged. But sometimes we know who performed the work and we have evidence, and we can then fine them accordingly. Next. Our tree replacement guidelines are kind of in the middle of the road as far as how, not extreme, but how significant the replacement requirement is. It's not a per inch requirement, but it is also not just one tree for one tree or 0 trees for one tree. We use a combination of size, condition, and species rating according to the MAC ISA tree replacement or tree species guide. And we have a table that calculates replacement. So I have an example here, which I'll use later for a violation 2, a 22-inch tree. It's a willow oak in this case. 70% condition, 80% species rating comes with this 12.32 replacement amount. And that translates to 3 replacements according to our table. If people can only plant one tree replacement, the rest is donated into the stormwater fund or into the tree canopy fund, depending on where the tree is located. Next, please. This is an example of that same tree, which was illegally removed, and we have the evidence that it was illegally removed. This is just an example. This is not actually something that happened, but this is a 22-inch willow oak, and you can see that when you use the Council for Tree and Landscape Appraisals and use kind of standard numbers and standard requirements for replacement costs, you end up with a $27,500 value of this tree, which is a lot higher than if one were to go through this legally. And luckily this doesn't happen very often. We only deal with this every once in a while, and usually people just ask for permission, or if there's something wrong with the tree, people can just request a maintenance inspection. Next. So most private trees are not legally protected in Arlington County, and honestly in Virginia, with some exceptions. So tree conservation happens by good land management. We have a lot of amazing partners with the tree stewards, master naturalists, master gardeners, and Virginia Tech Extension, who provide good education and support for private landowners to conserve their trees and replant their trees. We do also save trees through permitting by requiring our construction footprints to be as small as needed for the development that's permitted by code. I'll provide a short example of that. And we are starting to, we're wrapping up a pilot program for maintenance through the tree canopy fund. So this is that same fund that also plants trees on private property. We're trying to get people to maintain their large mature trees with this fund, and we're going to see how well this worked a little bit and see if we continue this. This is a little bit getting ahead of things, but people are often concerned about planting large trees. They're concerned about the long-term maintenance. So this is one way to look at it. Well, okay, there may be long-term maintenance funding available for keeping a large mature tree. And then, as mentioned before, we credit conservation of forests through our stormwater credits, which is a relatively new thing too. There is some legal protection of trees in resource protection areas near streams and in locally designated historic districts, but this is a small fraction of the county. Next, please. Here's some example of the education programs. Removing invasive vines can help. Non-native English ivy and porcelainberry are some of the major concerns in our county. And then we have communication about how to maintain your mature trees on the right, which is also, both of these are sponsored by the Master Naturalists and Tree Stewards and are still used, even though that's choking hazard. Education is quite old now. It's still very relevant and we still use it. Next. This is kind of a planning example of reducing construction footprint. On the left, you see trees saved in the back of the lot, and the construction footprint being only as large as the house that's permitted. And on the right, another example where people pulled back the limits of disturbance to reduce impact to existing forests and buffers. Next. So some overview, we use education, we use permit review, we enforce our public tree protection ordinance, we have resource protection areas and local historic districts. We collaborate with other public entities in the county and on the federal level to minimize impact from their projects and provide for plantable space. And then we do replant where possible through public and private funding. Next. And that's me. And you can always contact me. I'm pretty good with email, so I prefer that, but feel free to reach out in any way you need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Yeah, wonderful work at the county level, implementing some innovative policies and credits to continue to incentivize tree retention, right? Mature tree retention and retention of new canopy as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katie out of Baltimore.
Hi, I'm Katie Lauder. I'm the Executive Director of Baltimore Green Space. Baltimore Green Space is a land trust for community managed open spaces. We preserve community gardens, pocket parks, but we also teach people how to care for forests, and we preserve 2 forests now. Next slide. So welcome to the Govans Urban Forest Patch. We got involved in this forest and every forest we work with because of, next slide, neighbors like Charles Brown, who already loved their forest and wanted to know how best to care for and or protect it long-term. Next slide. Because we got so many inquiries from several neighbors at the same time about their community forest patches, we held our first meeting of the Forest Stewardship Network that included neighbors, nonprofit leaders, scientists, and government officials like the city forester, so that we might think together about how to serve forest stewards. So the Forest Stewardship Network always started with experts and neighbors together, and it continues to this day with quarterly meetings that govern our work. Next slide. Through these meetings, we developed a suite of educational offerings that rotate between things like birds practice, things like fun, things like bird walks, like this slide. And next slide. Practical workshops like trail maintenance. Next slide. And trash removal. Next slide. And through all of our work, we try to develop tools that will help and assist neighbors and community leaders and also policymakers. So this is Forest Patch First Aid, which you can find online. And at the close of this, I'll kind of link in several things for you. But this is a guide that kind of helps neighbors think about how to lead workshops in their forest. And also some of it was written by forest stewards and the entire thing was reviewed by them. Next slide. So another reason that we got involved with forest patches was because this little space This is historic Wilson Park, and this is Wilson Woods. And if you can see the house that's circled here, this neighbor had bought the lots behind his house in the side lot program. And we got a call that said, they're going to cut down our forest. Is there anything you can do to stop it? And so we scoured the regulations and we learned, next slide, that we could not stop him from cutting down the lots. The forest conservation triggers were too large to impact the site. Next slide. As you can see, the trees and the topsoil were lost. Soils are carbon sequesters and stormwater management magicians, as you know, and now all of these healthy soils are gone. Next slide. But that got us asking how many of these spaces existed in Baltimore, and where were they, and what were the legislative mechanisms that covered them, and the holes in legislation that needed to be addressed. So we released this white paper that kind of drills down on the analysis of both the regulations and GIS data layer of all the patches in our city. Next slide. And what we learned was that more than 20% of Baltimore's tree canopy is in forest patches outside of parks on land that can be bought and sold. So if you've got a 40% tree canopy goal, but you're constantly losing forest patches, then you have a problem. So this, Dr. Matt Baker helped us kind of develop this analysis. We eventually ground truthed it as well. So we've been on the ground in enough of these patches to know how well the analysis worked. Next slide. So that led us to doing some organizing around updating our tree ordinances. And I would advise the way that we did it was step one, we looked at model ordinances so that we can know what there was out there. And so no one could say, this has never been done before. People love to say that. And so we had a lot of examples of what had been done before. And then we gathered an interagency committee with relevant nonprofit leaders. This was the we worked with the Office of Sustainability on this. And I will say that back to the white paper we also worked with the Office of Sustainability at that time to make sure that forest patches were in kind of the other layers of city government. So when we looked at our legislation, we have a tree ordinance committee that's combined with interagency and nonprofit leaders. And I think that makes it a differently dynamic. But the other thing that we did that I think was really useful was we inventoried the current regulations that we had on the books to establish what was the easiest lift to start with in order to protect trees. And we established an order of what set of ordinances we were going to either update or propose. And so the first one we proposed was a forest conservation update, where we were going to update the triggers for forest conservation to 10,000 square feet. But as we moved through the process, we were encouraged to drop it down to 5,000 square feet because that's where other development regulations start. And so it would be easier for the system. So right now, our forest conservation regulations trigger at 5,000 square feet of disturbance. Next slide. And this is the ordinance number. And we are moving on to codifying the public property tree mitigation that is being embodied by the city forester right now. So there are certain mitigation requirements they follow on land, but it is not put into law. So the next law to come out this year will be to codify that so that it will be formally in the books. And then after that, we're going for a heritage tree rule. So that's kind of the full work of what the committee is working on there. Next slide. But the other thing that it's important to do with your forest patches is, in order to think about how to retain them and where to retain them, it's also crucial to understand what the health of them is. And so we've been to over 110 of these patches doing on the ground surveys. And then we eventually developed a forest health protocol. Next slide. Oh, wait, So some of our forests are really healthy, and this is an urban forest. When everybody sees this forest, they think it's a forest remnant. It's not, it's a patch. It was cleared at another point. We have the historical data layer, but it is beautiful. And so yeah, next slide. Back to the forest health protocol. We developed a rapid sampling protocol with Dr. Baker and the U.S. Forest Service, several scientists from the U.S. Forest Service. And what this does is it characterizes the health throughout a patch. And you can download it and look at it, and it is a step-by-step guide for how to do it. Next slide. And what we learned is that more than 85% of our tree canopy is native tree species, right? So you hear a lot about invasives, you hear a lot less about the native trees. Next slide. But while the canopy is native, the ground layer is extremely invaded. We can now really confidently say that English ivy is the biggest invader in forest patches in Baltimore. And in some cases, the ground layer is more than 90% invasive species. Next slide. And as you know, invasive species don't just stay on the ground, they get into the canopy. And next slide. They can kill your entire forest. Next slide. Oh, hold on, I'm gonna have to pull it up, make it bigger. So alert, without more consistent forest management strategies, understory will not grow up to replace forests which are aging out. It is really hard to find forest management funds, and results could include loss of species and habitat, climate change escalation, air quality degradation, water quality degradation, and increased heat-related deaths. This is serious, actually. A lot of our forests are getting to a point where they're aging out without any understory replacements. Next slide. And so what are we doing about it? We are working with several different nonprofits to think through different forest management career pathways. We're advocating for forest management credit, and which is now in the MS4 permits. It wasn't before. And there are several statewide legislation efforts that we've advocated for stewardship funding in as it relates to land trusts. There's one for the Keep the Maryland the Beautiful Act. This session will have some stewardship funding in it. And we're also kind of always advocating for grant programming initiatives to allow for this. CBT's grant funding does allow for management as a part of replacing in the forest patch of planting new trees. And then we try to raise awareness as much as possible with policymakers and other arenas, places like this. Next slide. So, once again, here we are with healthy forests. And one thing that is true that there's now better data out there on is that forests are the best at cooling of any tree use. So street trees, they're better than street trees. They're better than trees over grass. They have more cooling impact throughout the day than any other canopy. So you can look at the paper by Dr. Mike Alonso and Dr. Matt Baker on this. It is called, hold on, I'll just link it in the chat after the talk. But since forests are the best at cooling, next slide. This is what we're risking by losing forests, right? So it is 10 degrees hotter in this area than it is in the F forest, right? That is still next door to it. Next slide. And even this tourism website knows that heat is the #1 climate killer. Next slide. So it seems that retaining forests needs to be part of the answer. And we're grateful that this has been added to the MS4 permitting credit for forest conservation. But collectively, we need to advocate for a high usage of this type of mechanism and make sure that protection of forests gets more weight in literally everything. Next slide. Because whole neighborhoods are interested in retaining their forests. Next slide. And for many, it's even a family affair. This is Sylvester and Laretha Myers with their children and grandchildren and neighborhood friends. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Katie, for that presentation. A lot of great work. Congrats on the MS4 permit. That's big in getting forest patches in their rightful places, part of the overarching climate solution, and a way that we can advance the reduction of tree loss, hopefully overall in many more cities. So we've just wrapped this panel. We do have time for a couple of questions here. I'm gonna try and take it. There are some specific questions per speaker, so I'll just kind of go back in order here. I wanted to kind of start at the top with Karen and her presentation. Anne from Virginia asked, have any of the local localities that implemented a wait period shown an improvement in mature tree preservation? You had spoken to that in your presentation, and Anne from Virginia, and I was also curious about the success rate for those municipalities.
Well, they've one locality in particular that's done a great job with that is Beaufort, South Carolina, and yes, they have done a really good job on protecting mature trees as well as patches of forest. So happy to, if anyone wants to talk to those folks, happy to put you in touch with them. You can just shoot me an email.
Excellent, excellent. And also, Marian, you had mentioned some tree ordinance models out of the Forest Conservation Act. Is there a place that folks who are in Maryland can find those for reference?
It would be easier actually for them to contact me directly because it is on our they call it LexisNexis, or the legal website, and the link is huge. So if they email me, I did put the Forest Conservation web page up on the chat. My contact information's at the bottom. I can connect them to it. But again, the direct link is huge.
Excellent. So Nicole from Maryland, that was for you, and for everybody else in Maryland who's looking for that reference, or Baywide who's looking for that example. For Vincent, so folks were really excited about the maintenance protocols that you have been modeling in Arlington County. Do you have any guidance for folks who are looking at replicating something similar in their jurisdiction?
Yeah, so this is administered through a nonprofit, which is kind of a workaround in a way. It would be very difficult for a local jurisdiction in Virginia to do something like that through their government structure, because that may be seen as a gift to the local, to the homeowner or resident or property owner. So you have to kind of work out what the legalities are around it. So spend a lot of time on whether it's legal to do a program like this, and this is right now a pilot program. But the way I've kind of structured, we've kind of structured it is the nonprofit hires a good certified arborist to do an assessment. They pay for the assessment. The assessment has recommendations. The recommendations are reviewed by a commission, which includes one of my staff and commission members from the Forestry and Natural Resources Commission to kind of have to look at things like equity and fairness, and approved through that process. So you have a professional with a technical opinion who provides an opinion, and that gets voted on, and then a private contractor performs the work. So that gets around some of the liability concerns if something happens where the private contractor damages something, that's on their liability. and the assessment is done by a separate private arborist too. So you can have to compartmentalize things, but that's how I think it will work. And I hope it will help encourage people to keep mature trees in their community.
And yes, and speaking of mature trees, Katie, one of the big pieces about forest patches, I mean, tree maintenance writ large is around stewardship, right? And being able to kind of overemphasize stewardship as a benefit, and not just like the tree benefit themselves, but the community value that comes. Can you talk a little bit to how that's helped advance your cause and maybe withstand some of the pressure that development can bear on just like what looks to them as big investments, lands that are just like ripe for investment, right?
Well, I mean, we have a little bit of a different landscape in Baltimore where it's, we don't have as much pressure on our forest patches as I understand the counties do. But we have found that really understanding the forest ecology and making sure and working at the intersection of what community loves and is interested in and how that connects to their forested area is really kind of where we do our work, right? So the neighbor that loves big trees, we identify all the big trees, and the neighbor that loves the understory, we do a native plant walk that is about, the understory. And what that results in, and some of these inventories result in, is finding things, valuable ecosystem things that nobody ever expects to be in an urban forest. We've identified endangered species. We've identified, trees that American elm that survived, right? Trees that nobody expects. So this is also kind of, urban areas have what I'd call an island effect in some of their patches. So a lot of the focus ends up being on connectivity in a rural area, but having an island effect on a patch where there's an endangered species and a tree that didn't survive anywhere else is this other thing that's precious, right? And so that's kind of the narrative of preciousness is really important.
Excellent. We had another question around affordable housing and the proximity of trees, well-maintained trees, to affordable housing, and the effects that has on development and on the ability for to reduce, tree loss. Can anybody who's on the panel speak to that? We had, I think, some folks who were curious about it on Marian's end, on if the forest conservation plan has had any kind of effect on the tree maintenance around affordable housing, if it's potentially driven housing prices up or the like. But I think this is a fair question for everybody with your different perspectives as well.
Forest Conservation Act, at least from what I see, my office reviews state projects on state land, federal projects on federal land. So the type of projects you're talking about are reviewed more at the county and town level. And I'm not aware of whether it's driving up prices or not, and how it impacts affordable housing. That's more of someone at a county level to answer than someone at a state level.
I would tackle that really quickly, just to tell you guys that when you do anytime you have a neighborhood that wasn't green and becomes greener, it's generally a true statement that the property values will increase. But if you think about it from the perspective of a homeowner who's low income, whose property becomes more valuable, that can be a true value to the homeowner themselves. But in terms of affordable housing, this is an issue I've actually worked quite a lot on in my life and continue to work on. And if you have a community-based project, you can also tackle affordable housing as part of the project. So working with the housing authority, for example, in one neighborhood I worked in, there are a lot of boarded up housing that actually were owned by the housing authority. So getting those rehab brought back to life and getting families moved into them can be part of your urban forestry project. I've also seen other projects, for example, where they, the city put a sort of a cap on the property taxes around park renovation projects so that low-income residents wouldn't suddenly have to pay higher taxes because the park made the neighborhood more valuable. So there's a lot of different tools. It doesn't have to be, I just hate to see things be trees versus affordable housing. It doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah, and I would say that in Baltimore, we've seen that when we preserve either a forest or a garden, like investment in all of the houses around the space go up, right? So people start rehabbing houses around a preserved space that is green. We've also seen developers purchase whole things they weren't going to purchase when something like a farm or a garden is nearby, and say that that is why they purchased. And then we've gotten requests from the planning department once we did this patch map to figure out how to create a brochure that markets the things that are near to forested spaces, because and we also see that forested spaces that are cared for, the dumping in the neighborhood decreases. So, I mean, all of those things are, you know, while they could be, there's another argument about like being worried about gentrification there, but like keeping out development is not something we see so much.
Great. Well, if there's any other like burning desire guidance, I mean, there's a lot of content that we just went through. I think folks are excited to figure out how they can implement the guidance that you all provided and the case studies you all provided at their level of influence. Maybe like if you all had one kind of main thought about how, like one takeaway from your perspective on effectively equipping people in policy decision-making spaces and people in funding decision-making spaces, one tip that they could take away to say, this is going to be the thing that makes a big difference.
Well, I'll just end on my main theme, which is that you have to look comprehensively at all your policies. So if you are planting 400 trees in one part of the city and paving away 1,000 on another part of the city, you didn't win. So that's why you really need to look at all of the codes and policies that drive how much pavement your city is having. And you know, what type of incentives are you offering? So you don't want just regulations, you also want incentives. I've done a lot of work with developers who aren't necessarily ever calling themselves environmentalists, but will save trees because it makes them a different kind of green.
I would say a couple things. I think there needs to be different environmental markers to incentivize in rural and urban environments. It's not often enough. Sometimes it's like we decide what's environmentally valuable in a rural area and then nothing in an urban area applies, right? So a lot of the triggers for getting funding for conserving land start at 5 acres or more. You know, we've documented forest interior dwellers in 2.5 acres. And so some of those measures that you're defining that are very relevant to rural areas actually just knock anything in an urban area out from being included. And then I would say this issue of forest management is an issue across urban and rural divide. Like everybody, even in the rural areas, are saying like, we've got deer pressure and we don't have any seedlings coming up, but we've got a lot of old trees. If we don't think now about that, it's going to be too late.
Other thoughts from Marian or Vincent?
I think a lot of this has been expressed. We're trying to work with the affordable housing and in our community, the missing middle issue as well. And just our broad policy is that people who live in affordable housing have just as much need for access to nature and green space and trees.
My one comment is don't be afraid to ask your state or local government, urban and community forestry program people. Me and Vincent, like, we know what's going on. We have ideas. We can reach out to communities and make connections for those that, you know, the policymakers, those that have the funding, where we are capable, we are in place to help you. I just see a lot of times people avoid us because we're government, and we're here to help. Okay, so please feel free to reach out. That's all.
Excellent. That's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you all for this great discussion on mitigating tree loss in communities across the watershed. Looking forward to continuing the conversation. I will ping it over to Brandy, who will tee us up for our afternoon discussion rooms. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had very robust discussions. I got to listen in on quite a few sessions and looked like everybody was problem solving, looking at these policy solutions and overcoming roadblocks and figuring out some practical alternatives to move forward in your work. And so really excited to get the recap to review all of the feedback that came through in the discussions. And so we made it through day one. You know, we tackled the themes of climate, we tackled how to mitigate tree loss, and the few themes that I heard coming up in a lot of the discussions today were around education, awareness, and trying to translate that education and awareness for communities across the watershed into policy, right? Into practical action and a structure that can help undergird sustained investment in the expansion and enhancement of our community tree canopy all over the watershed. And so I heard a lot about breaking more complicated concepts down into plain language so that we can make ourselves and our work understood. I heard a lot about making research and tools more accessible, demystifying grants and grant processes, and educating people on the fact that grants exist or other kinds of resources and technical assistance even exist at all. And, you know, all of that is so critical and so important. But I'm curious, you know, if that great work doesn't necessarily go far enough. I'm curious if, you know, meeting people where we think they might be, right, with plain language, you know, fact sheets, or with educational seminars, maybe the idea we have in our minds is not necessarily meeting up with reality. And so we're going to get a little bit more insight on how we can package the important work that needs to get done in a way that truly does bridge the gap between the work that needs to get done and the folks who could benefit most from it via our agenda item tomorrow, which is equity. And so we're going to hear from a keynote out of Richmond, Virginia, and from a lineup of panelists who are doing really thoughtful work in this arena. And so in the afternoon tomorrow, we'll also start identifying some solution pathways for policy and funding actions in each state in the coming 3 years. So come ready to roll up your sleeves. We're going to continue the great momentum that's been begun here. And, you know, we want to also leave you with one more tool to explore later on the afternoon, which is the county tree cover status and change fact sheets. Julie talked about these earlier at the top of our call today. She said they were hot off the press, the hottest. Okay, it's exclusive. It's not exclusive. They're open for everybody. That's the point. It's inclusive. But these fact sheets are top tier. Okay, you can check out what the stats are for your county. Definitely check them out so that you have some talking points to come ready to express or react to or talk about for tomorrow's discussions. And we are really excited to see if we can, innovate a little bit more, push ourselves a little bit further to advance the cause that we know is going to support the resiliency of the entire watershed. And so would love if everybody could share one key takeaway that they learned, that they had to reframe in their mind, that they were challenged by possibly today during your discussions or by some of the panelists. Would love to read those in the chat. And maybe it's something that's helpful that you want to implement or that you're excited about pursuing, or maybe you're connecting with somebody new or reconnecting with somebody that you think you may be able to make a partnership with to advance this work. So I'm going to scan the chat. We're going to hear some reactions from folks. If folks have things that were insightful, would love to hear. Or, everybody might just say like, my brain is at capacity. I'm ready for a nap, Sarah. And that's also reasonable because we are humans. So I know that the one thing that I learned was I had no idea that there were so many additional tracking tools available, and that there's a lot more resources at hand than I was previously aware of to incentivize folks to preserve trees in accordance with like climate adaptation and mitigation measures. And so I was really impressed by some of those efforts that were shared today. And yeah, it was great to hear that. It was very encouraging. Other helpful things were, all right, stormwater fees and discounts. Yeah. A lot of unexpected, to me, like my thoughts. Yeah, there's like just pots of money that can be made, that can be collected and put to great use, if we structure our policies right, which is the goal, right? We design our plans well, we can all reap the benefits long term, which is fantastic. Folks really enjoyed learning about the programs all over the watershed. Excellent. Yeah, there is a huge connection with emergency management, Sophie. Fantastic point. We know that, especially in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, I mean, these are all, except for, I guess, West Virginia and DC, coastal states. So everybody, for the most part, borders the coast. And even though a couple of folks are more inland, you're still going to be affected by coastal climate change patterns or changing climate patterns. So really important. Folks found the forest patchwork inspiring with the progression of the MS4 permit inclusion. That's fantastic. Getting some hands on these tools. Okay, again, get your hands on these tools. That's why they were created. They're created for you. And so really, really good to hear all of that. I don't know if there's any additional key points that my co-organizers or the organizers of the project team would like to point out before I wrap us up for the day, but I want to turn it over to you all so that I don't miss anything. No, I think we're in the all clear.
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone again for joining us, and very specifically to the peer facilitators and note takers who stepped up and really took a lead on that. I appreciate it a lot. And thank you for participating today and again tomorrow.
Yeah, I would like to echo that, Brandy. Thanks so much, everyone, for sticking with us. I know it's a long day, there's a lot of content coming at you, and but it's great to see the enthusiasm and engagement. And please know that, you know, all the ideas that are coming in through these breakout sessions are going to be so valuable for us trying to chart a course going forward to make sure that the priority needs and gaps and strategies are going to be well reflected and addressed. So come on back tomorrow and keep bringing all the great ideas. And thanks to all our awesome presenters today. It was really fabulous.
Yes, thank you all. We will, for participating, we will see you bright and early tomorrow morning, same time, same place, for day 2 of the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Tree Canopy Funding and Policy Roundtable. And with that, we'll see you tomorrow. We'll see you in the morning. Take care.